Well, we're officially in March 2020, which means it's time to once again look back on the animated films that came out in 2019. Specifically the theatrical ones, of course. This might just be the biggest year that I've had for Animation Explosion. Not just because practically every animation studio played a part in bringing out a movie, but because there's a lot of movies to talk about. 19 is currently the most I've had to talk about. That's almost the entire month. However, that high number in of itself isn't going to stop me from talking about each film that was given to us. Unfortunately, 2019 was also home to probably the most amount of unoriginal animated movies as well. I mean, this year was filled with sequels, adaptations, remakes, rip-offs, etc. I could probably count a good 6 original ideas out of 19. Now yes, the more important discussion is whether or not they were good, but now it seems like every studio is doing the sequelitis trap. There will even be a few movies this month that you probably won't even expect to see me talk about, for better or for worse. But like I said, if it's a theatrical release in any way, shape or form, that counts as a film to be reviewed in this marathon. It's also neat that this year also brought DreamWorks, Laika, Nickelodeon and Blue Sky into the limelight again, seeing as how they didn't even have an animated film last year, some cases not even films in ages. Now keep in mind that I'm going by these films in the order that they were specifically released here in Australia, since I often like to follow my country's own guidelines. Also keep in mind that a lot of these videos will have spoilers, but warnings will be applied in videos that actually have them. So sit back, grab some popcorn, and get yourself comfortable. It's Animation Explosion 2020 edition. So let's start this year off with not the LEGO Movie 2 like everyone else got, but rather the third and final installment of the Dragons franchise, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. It's interesting to think about why this movie was released almost 2 months earlier in Australia than in the United States. Could it be due to a deal between Universal and the Australian Film Corporation? Or were DreamWorks just nice enough to give Aussies an early muncher, presumably their last good movie for a long time? Anywho, it shouldn't come off as a surprise that I'm a big fan of the Dragons franchise. The first one was a surprisingly spectacular film, and this is coming from someone who's not all familiar with the books. What's crazy is that it took a lot of cliches I usually can't stand and somehow managed to make them work really well. The sequel is one of my favorite DreamWorks films of all time. I love it so much. It took something that worked and multiplied it 10 times more. Which is why it really breaks my heart to admit that, as a finale to one of my favorite franchises of the decade, Hidden World came and went on a somewhat sour note. Now, that's not to say this movie's bad. Far from it, but it suffers one major problem that I feel makes it the worst film in the trilogy. That and a few other minor things as well. It begins shortly after the events of the second film, where the Burkians are welcoming more dragons into their village and Hiccup is getting used to his new role as chief. But when an evil dragon hunter named Grimmel wants to kill Toothless and take the other dragons captive, the Burkians decide to leave the place in order to find a safer place to live. All of which are unaware that Grimmel has sent out a light fury to woo Toothless and tease him enough so he can capture him. Already the plot sounds eerily similar to the conflict in the second movie, in which Drago was using an alpha to control the other dragons and take over Burke. I don't mind a repeated conflict if it had enough twists and turns to make it engaging, but instead it just goes straight down the cliched and predictable route. How to Train Your Dragon 3 definitely feels like the Toy Story 3 of the franchise, and I don't mean that in a very positive way. When it comes to the story as is, it also raises a lot of questions. Why doesn't Grimmel just kill Toothless? If he claims that he's killed every single Night Fury on the planet, then why doesn't he just go right in and kill Toothless instead of just teasing him with a pretty girl dragon that Toothless immediately has the hots for? It'd probably be a lot quicker and would prevent him from getting noticed. His motivations seem pathetically one note as well, as he's only doing this for self-praise and not for a revenge plot or anything that would make sense in context of his goals. And speaking of Toothless, it feels bizarrely out of character that he would immediately fall for the Light Fury the second he sees her. And what makes this element even more baffling is that Toothless only spends about 4 minutes of screen time with her before deciding he wants to leave Hiccup and spend the rest of his life with her. Most evident when he gets his new tail. I know Toothless has been searching for more of his kind for a long time, but think about what he's done in the other 2 movies. He went against nature's intended rules to protect Hiccup and stand proud as alpha of the dragons. It just doesn't seem right that his character would instantly do this in a brief period of time. And this partakes in what is easily the movie's biggest flaw. It feels like its own separate story that tries to throw everything that was achieved in the first two movies out of the window. The first two movies were all about challenging preconceived notions by having an unlikely bond between a Viking and a dragon, and both species have been at each other's throats for generations. Hiccup and Toothless managed to accomplish things that nobody ever could. They killed a queen dragon, and Toothless stood up to the king of dragons in the second film to protect Hiccup. So when you have a finale that contradicts what was learned in the movies that came before it, I begin to question if this movie had any rewrites at all. This series has been all about making Vikings believe that dragons are not actually monsters, but giant cat-like creatures that can be tamed and loved. This point was even proven to Valka in the second movie, where she does learn that humans can change and adapt to dragons despite history's nature intended. I know the dragon riders are supposed to learn to not be so reliant on their dragons, but what does that imply when the same movie has Toothless wanting to leave Hiccup and then all the dragons leaving because of this carbon copy villain from the second movie? And with that said, let's talk about the ending. After the villain is presumably killed, you can't convince me he just drowned right here with no explanation. The Vikings decide that dragons can't live in peace with them as long as many horrible people in the world continue to hunt them down, so the dragons leave towards the hidden world. And I mean every single dragon. At first I wasn't really bothered by the ending. I thought, okay, it makes sense. Not all humans are gonna adapt to dragons, and it makes sense for them to hide until humanity can change. But then I watched this video from a YouTuber known as Toon Ruins, and she mentioned this.
Basically, what was said at the end of the movie was that humans are selfish creatures who will continually exploit and abuse dragons, and that they are incapable of change, which is an idiotic sentiment considering the entirety of Burke changed their views overnight in the first movie.
I literally couldn't sum it up any better. This ending best describes the movie's biggest flaw. I understand that not every dragon is going to easily adapt to humans and vice versa. These two species have been trying to kill one another for generations, but what the hell are the Vikings supposed to learn now once the dragons have disappeared off the planet? Especially since, according to Hiccup, people stopped believing in dragons 10 years after they disappeared. Seems a little contradictory to what was said before, in that dragons and humans don't have to be separated forever. But how are humans supposed to adapt to dragons if they can't see or believe in them? If you want to have the humans being less dependent on the dragons, fine, but that shouldn't equal all the dragons disappearing. Why not have it instead where the dragons leave for a brief while because of mating season, and that Toothless needs to spend a little bit of time away from Hiccup to get the Life Fury to adapt to humans better? And while you're at it, have him be a little reluctant on his relationship with her. Why not show other real world problems like bigger dragons showing up and the dragon riders needing to sort the problem out without their own dragons? I would go further into detail, but that one video explains enough of what I need to, so I'll leave a link in the description if you wish to check it out. And it really sucks what this movie went for, because there's still a lot of good things about it. The animation is still gorgeous, and I'd even argue is the best looking of the Dragons films. The soundtrack is wonderful, most of the characters are still likable and funny, and there are still plenty of action scenes that are exciting and fun. It's just that this didn't feel like the proper way to conclude the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy. Overall though, it is still good, though I say that with some slight hesitation. If this movie did make you emotional, great. If it moved you, great. If you loved this one the most out of all of them, that's wonderful. But I have to speak where my mind is, and I don't think this film felt very appropriate with its franchise's topic on changing the status quo. And it's because of that that I now proclaim the Kung Fu Panda trilogy as DreamWorks' most consistent and well-rounded trilogy. It's certainly not the biggest disappointment DreamWorks has made, but in terms of their franchises, it feels the most out of place with what it was going for. If you enjoy it, that's fine, but I think I'm going to stick with the first two for now. Norm of the North, Keys to the Kingdom, the sequel to the cultural film that tainted our cinema screens in 2016. And by cultural, I damn sure mean it left one scarring impact. Yoshi player veterans will know full well my thoughts on the first Norm of the North film. I swear it's become a meme at this point. I hate the first one so much. The awful animation, the offensively stupid plot, the abysmal writing. It was considered one of the worst movies of 2016 for a reason. Yet, I guess because the film actually made more money than its budget, Splash Entertainment felt it was best to give this twerking fuckhead a sequel. I mean, given the ridiculous amount of Alpha and Omega sequels they've made, this shouldn't be all that surprising. But what's even worse is that this film got a limited theatrical release. And spoiler warning, the reason why is really stupid. Well, whatever, what's going on this time around? Norm has become the new king of the Arctic, who now has 3 kids, one of whom looks exactly like young Norm from the first movie. And now he's going to be given the key to New York City, a way to bring peace between the humans of New York and the animals of the Arctic. However, Norm gets framed for robbing banks, and so now he and his friends have to try and clear his name. And right when this conflict was introduced, the real culprit immediately gave it away. Can you guess who it is? If you can, you're smarter than this movie. Then again, I think even 2-year-olds can figure out the obvious shit in this movie. So as you can imagine, seeing how this is a sequel to Norm of the North, most of the same problems still apply here. It's baffling to admit this movie isn't quite as bad as the first one, but that won't excuse this movie's lack of compelling narratives. Norm can still communicate with humans, and it's even implied the same can be done with Norm's son. I didn't figure that out myself, I just never bothered to care. The lemmings return once again, albeit not as annoying here since there's no sequence of them peeing into a fish tank, but that didn't excuse them needing to be there. I remember when I first watched the movie with Nick and Cleve and how I was genuinely glad that Norm didn't want to take the lemmings with him this time around, and then the little fuckers go with him anyway. Just go away! Your movie is immediately better without you! And I don't know how they managed to do it, but the animation is even worse than the first one. The movements are more stiff and uncomfortable, the laws of logic still don't apply, notably one point where Norm rapidly flips onto a helicopter and even flies through the blades, but even character models look off. There's this one scene where the mayor is being interviewed and the two look like they're both from different movies, where the animator's just lazy? That could be a good point, since this movie has the city looking totally lifeless. Oh, but you want to know what's the biggest crime this movie committed? Well, it existing is one thing, but halfway through this film, the conflict is already resolved. At first I thought this was gonna come back a little later on, except a completely different conflict is introduced. Now there's a group of Russians who want to take ice from the Arctic and turn it into water, so the animals decide to challenge them to a hockey game. Taking out how distractingly half-assed it is for animals to suddenly play a hockey game, where did this plot come from? That is until I discovered that this plot was originally gonna be its own story called Arctic All-Stars. That is the only reason why this movie was released in selected theaters, because all of a sudden it was long enough to justify an excuse. How lazy is that? Was the first story just not interesting enough to extend? It still doesn't help that this other story is just as boring and even more cliched than the last. I'll give it this, that the villain's plan was somewhat clever, but I also have to put up with Norm's unlikable brother. He takes up all the glory and never shares it with anyone. He got so irritating that it actually made me feel bad for Norm, and I never thought I would ever say that ever. This movie also introduces a new character, this weird, talking, possibly racist stereotype rabbit who serves no other purpose in the movie other than to just have all the easy answers for Norm, and apparently he can talk to humans too? He's able to talk to Vera and Olympia just fine, but when was this a thing? When and how does Norm know him? Why does Vera give him bedroom eyes at one point? The first film's pissing scene was bad enough, but I don't need to be given implications of bestiality in this universe. I also can't stand how these movies keep glorifying Norm. They keep praising him like he's this savior of the Arctic and that he has no faults, and likes to point out plot holes from the first movie. Like the writers knew it was a problem and they didn't care. I could go on about how ridiculously stupid this whole thing is, but I think you guys get the picture. Norm of the North 2 is a movie that had no right to exist given the backlash the last one got, and apparently it warranted 2 more sequels after this one. I guess it's not as bad as the first one. I mean, the first one was was so offensively stupid, this one is just so bland and cliched. But if I wasn't watching it with Nick and Cleve, I would have turned it off about maybe 20 minutes in, should you even last that long in the first place. I'm grateful it didn't make me dumber like the first one did, but one more rewatch out of these two movies and I might die of brain damage. So after we had a couple of spin-off films, one of which I loved and one that was serviceable, it's time for the highly anticipated LEGO Movie sequel, The LEGO Movie 2, the second part. God, I love that name. Ever since the success and praise that the first LEGO Movie got, this meant people could go into LEGO Movie 2 with higher expectations. I mean, let's not forget a lot of people went into the first movie expecting it to be terrible. Lo and behold, it blew audiences away and spawned an entire LEGO Movie franchise. Does that carry along for this film? Let's go in and find out. Taking place directly after the events of the last movie, a group of aliens have invaded Bricksburg and a war begins to break out, turning the once awesome city into a desert wasteland where everyone, except Emmett, have adapted to the time. One day, Emmett's friends are taken by the Sister System, where the Queen wants to bring peace to both worlds and marry Batman along the way. While Emmett ventures forth to rescue everyone, he's joined by the venturous Rex Dangervest, who agrees to help him on his quest. So, since this is a sequel to the first LEGO movie, a lot of people were in an agreement that it wasn't going to feel as fresh as before, and they aren't wrong. The idea of LEGO characters taking advantage of the world they're in and showing the true power of imagination isn't something that could be topped for a sequel. But trust me when I say this movie may not be as fresh as before, but it's not trying to be. All it wants to be is a fun and comedic-filled sequel to a film everybody loved. And that's where I think this movie succeeds. Even the plot itself has an insane identity, like how it starts as this simple rescue mission film and all of a sudden throwing in a lot of twists and turns that the audience wouldn't expect. It's kind of like the first movie and how they showed off the world of LEGO from a kid's point of view, but this movie goes to even more extremes with its plot twists. Even some plot twists I was worried about because they involved time travel are actually handled better than I imagined. I appreciate this movie's message on how violence isn't always the answer to problems. Sometimes you just need to take a step back and think about your actions before pursuing them. In a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of Ferdinand and how the titular character is presented as soft and cuddly rather than aggressive and violent like the other bulls. But I'd argue this film handles it a lot better, because it doesn't go down the cliched route by showing that everyone's wrong for trying to change Emmett for the better. Instead, it just has Emmett learning the risks of trying to act outside of your comfort zone, and the movie does a fantastic job showcasing Emmett's optimism as both a pro and a con. A con being that he can be very naive to people that try to take advantage of him, but also a pro because he can inspire others to change for the better. The new character Rex is hilarious satire on all the stereotypical male role models that movies often tend to do nowadays. And without giving anything away, he does have a plot twist that occurs in the third act, but it never comes across as force. While the movie does showcase Rex genuinely wanting to help Emmett in his quest, you can also tell that something seems off about him. Sometimes he seems a bit unhappy and angry in his position. He's a brilliantly handled character who never got annoying. The other characters pretty much remain the same. Batman is still the same dark emo comic relief that he always has been. Wildstyle has a great character arc about learning to accept Emmett for who he is. Even the new characters are great. I love the queen of the Sister System who wants to distract Emmett's friends with catchy music and bring peace to both worlds, and how at first she seems evil but it turns out she's actually not. And much like the first movie, it's still really funny as well. I think one of the elements that made me laugh the most were all the out-of-nowhere songs that were placed, technically making this movie a musical. They all sound great and are very catchy. It still carries the same comedic timing and delivery as before for the most part. It's still a very funny movie, but I feel as though at times the delivery of certain jokes aren't quite as tight as they used to be. I remember the first film had rapid fire pacing for all the jokes, and this one takes a little bit more time with them. That's also probably a pet peeve I have with this movie. When it wants to slow down at points, particularly in the beginning, it can feel kind of draining. I mean, I know why they had to do this, to build up all the suspension that it'll deliver later on, but I could have used some more funny moments here and there. That's not to say those parts are bad, they certainly aren't even close, but I can imagine some people getting bored by these scenes. Aside from from that though, there's no other complaints. The LEGO Movie 2 delivers most of the same qualities as before. Excellent writing, lovable characters, phenomenal animation, catchy songs, the works. I think I actually like this movie more than The Hidden World, because this time around it felt more consistent in the prose it delivered and didn't have a contradictory ending. I wasn't expecting a whole lot from this movie when it was coming out, as I feared it was heading towards the safe sequel territory, but it still delivered the best with what it had. I obviously don't think it's as good as the original or even the LEGO Batman movie, but it's still a hell of a lot better than LEGO Ninjago. I definitely recommend it if you're a fan of LEGO or animated movies in general. If you've already seen this movie, then, well, just go rewatch it again. I know I'm going to, and have a great time doing so. Okay, so it won't come as a surprise that 2019 definitely had some bad animated movies, but for some strange reason, out of all the bad animated movies I saw that year, Wonder Park was the one I wanted to like the most. When the first trailer came out in 2018, it genuinely caught my interest. A story of a little girl discovering a magical theme park? How could this not be good? And as more and more trailers came out, I admittedly became a little less interested, but otherwise still keen on seeing it. Then when the day came and I finally saw it at the cinema, I initially thought the film was fine. Nothing special, nothing harmful, just fine. But then later, when I rewatched it once for a deeper analysis and again for this video, I discovered a lot more problems with it than I did before. Which is why it kind of pains me to admit that in this day and age, yeah, I think this movie's pretty lackluster. That's not to say it's awful, but it has some strange decisions for a kid's film. But alright, one step at a time. We center on a little girl named June, who imagines of a wondrous place known as Wonderland. Yeah, not Wonder Park like the title of this film. Anyway, she loves coming up with all sorts of rides alongside her friends and her mother. But when her mother gets sick and has to leave for a bit, June starts to lose the spark of imagination and puts Wonderland away. So her father decides to send her on a camping trip, but when she believes he won't be able to take care of himself, she leaves for home but unexpectedly comes across Wonderland herself, only for her to discover that the whole place is in a wreck thanks to a group of chimpanzee zombies, and their leader Peanut has been captured and thrown into this dark cloud that I believe is where all the parts go with it. Alright, so what is it with this movie? What made me want to like it so badly despite how it turned out? Well, look at it! This has to be one of the cutest looking films I've seen in quite some time. The characters are easy on the eyes, yet still give off some decent expressions. The actual environments in this movie are gorgeous to look at. It's just so distinct and cute. It just gives the movie its own style that I didn't think was possible to do for a film called Wonder Park. That really is the movie's biggest strength, just how it looks. And yet when you take a step back and look at what this movie is going for, it begs the question, how can something like this turn out to be so lackluster? Well, let's look at the trailer. It gives you a feeling of warmth and comfort, like this is preparing you for this lively and colourful film that you can get into easily. It has all these fantasy rides, talking animals, lively animation. What else can that tell you other than you're going to be in for a joyful time? The problem is that the movie itself is the complete opposite of that. What I mean is, whereas about 35% of this movie is trying to be lively and positive, the rest of it has this unnecessarily depressing tone. Now, it's not scathingly sour like Chicken Little or Mickey's Twice Upon a Christmas, but would you ever expect a movie set in a fantasy park to have a little girl coping with possibly losing her mother and then putting that girl in this wasteland where a bunch of monkey zombies are trying to demolish everything in their way while all the animal residents have turned into one-dimensional jerks? Yeah, you probably wouldn't. I suppose it's better to have some negativity in your animated movie. We don't want another troll situation here. But you can't do that when you advertise your own product as this comfort zone to ease yourself into. It gives the world an unnecessarily depressing and kind of mean-spirited tone that feels out of place. It doesn't help that the story is also incredibly generic. I didn't go into this movie expecting anything original, but how many times are we going to have a story about a bunch of talking animals going on some wacky adventure to save something? And when the movie's not trying to do that, it can get a little too ridiculous as well. And I know, for a movie called Wonder Park, that shouldn't be such a big problem. But for example, June and her mother are constantly talking about Wonderland like it's a story. Fair enough. But then during the next scene, June starts doing this in public in front of a group of kids. Almost like they're trying to treat this like real magic. What the hell do these kids think are gonna happen? Some magical flying fish popping out of nowhere? I understand that kids are supposed to have imagination and stuff, but you continue to say that while you have June trying to build a ride representing Wonderland. Doesn't that seem a little bit redundant? But the worst part of the plot is towards the end. Not only does it feel the need to have an unnecessary breakup scene between the main characters, but June discovers a way to fix up the park. Not by sparking her imagination, but because she read some notes that her mother left. Well, wait a minute, I thought this movie was supposed to be about June rediscovering her imagination and spark for Wonderland. How is it that now she knows what to do because she read a note from her mother? Character-wise, there's not a whole lot I can say. The only character I unsurprisingly liked in this movie was June, but just because she's the only character that comes off as somewhat likable. As well as her being given a lot of shit that I ended up feeling sorry for her. The animal characters are too annoying and unnecessary. I get why they need to be there, but they have nothing unique to them other than just running gags. And considering this is a comedy film, the comedy is very lackluster too. I don't think I got one chuckle out of this movie. Maybe every so often I'd have a little nose laugh from whatever June was cooking up or how caring she suddenly becomes towards her father, but that's the most I got out of it. Other than that, as I mentioned before, it resorts to running gags, like how the blue bear keeps falling asleep, the Pumbaa female constantly yelling at people, the two beaver twins who do nothing but ramble on about whatever the hell they're talking about, and John Oliver with this incredibly pointless subplot of him wanting to win the heart of the warthog. It's not funny, comes in when it's not needed, and serves as stupid comedy fodder. And not only that, but even June's best friend has a love plot with her as well, that way too often reminds me of Clyde and Laurie from The Loud House. How dare you remind me of that shit show of a ship, Paramount. I was trying to think if there was anything in this movie that actually left a positive impact on me, and I will admit, when the movie does try to have a nice moment, it is genuinely effective. I like the scene where June finds Peanut and they just talk about their problems. No unnecessary comedy, no stupid conflict, just these two characters talking, and that's all it needs. I will say the message is actually pretty decent. Telling kids about the difficulties of possibly losing a loved one is a pretty deep message for an animated children's film. Even though the message can be really on the nose at times, when it does attempt to take itself seriously, it does leave an impact. Unfortunately, not all of it is handled well, because at the end of the movie, June's mother is actually alive. Alright then. On the one hand, I can give this movie praise for not pulling off the unnecessary parent death cliche, but then I remembered that this movie is all about trying to cope with the death of a parent, yet still trying to keep the spark and imagination alive. I wouldn't have cared either way what they did with June's mother, but this might actually be one of the rare situations where if she did die, it might have been more powerful. I hesitate to say that Wonder Park is an awful movie, since while it does have a very inconsistent pace and story that flies all over the place, it does have some nice animation and some pretty talented voice work. The characters aren't very distinct and some of them can get annoying, but I wouldn't say I despised any of them. I guess since I've seen other animated movies that felt more unpleasant, that it made sitting through Wonder Park a whole lot easier, but I don't think I could even recommend this to kids. There is a TV show coming out, so maybe I'll give that a watch and see if it's any better than the movie. Hell, since it looks to have a more pleasant tone, it possibly could be, but there's still a high chance it could blow hard. Seriously, what the fuck is that thing? Like I said, I did want to like this movie so badly because of its adorable art style and colourful atmosphere, but its too surrounded and unnecessary cruelty and unfunny writing that caused me to finally admit that, yeah, this movie is pretty bad. Not the worst of the year by a long shot, but this is a ride you can easily skip. It seems like every year when I do Animation Explosion, there's always a movie I usually don't like as much as others. For 2017, it was the My Little Pony movie, 2018 was definitely Ralph Breaks the Internet, and this year that movie is missing Link. Okay, just hear me out. I know this movie won the Golden Globe Award for Best Animated Feature, but ever since I saw the movie, I gotta admit, I never understood the hype behind it. It's not like this is the first Laika film to get that different response from me. Kubo and the Two Strings is a film everybody adores, and I thought it was just okay. And in Missing Link's defense, I certainly don't think the movie is awful, it just has too many flaws to prevent it from being anything spectacular. An eccentric man, played by Hugh Jackman, loves to discover mythical creatures. One day he wants to join a group of adventurers, but they turn him away. When he discovers the location of Sasquatch, he makes a bet with the leader that if he can bring him evidence, then he can join the club. To his surprise, and not really to mine, the legendary Sasquatch named Mr. Link can talk and wants to find his family. So right off the bat, this movie has a lot to differentiate itself from Laika's other films. Instead of going for a more serious, dark thriller film, they decide to steer towards a more comedy and down-to-earth storyline. I mean, this movie doesn't even focus on a child, which other Laika movies have done. Which I'm all for if this proves that Laika can focus on a different genre of filmmaking rather than the standard they've adapted to for years. Something good can come out of it. But there also lies the problem. Because this movie is going for a different storytelling style, it doesn't have the same unique twists and surprises that have made other Laika films so strong, especially those like Coraline. And that's because Missing Link is filled with a lot of generic, cliched, and boring plot twists that bring it down. Hugh Jackman's character suffers the same old character needs to become less selfish thing, which feels very reminiscent of films like Cars and The Emperor's New Groove. But whereas the latter film did a solid job introducing Kuzco as a funny character and subtle hints of his change into a better person, Jackman's character arc feels very forced and not all that developed. And of course, this movie's going to hit those points when it needs to, ultimately making his arc feel rushed, unpaced, and empty. Hell, by the time he starts learning to be a better person, it's only after he's told to stop being selfish. I'm sorry, but how is that a redeeming character arc? And the adventure itself, it should be a lot better than this. This movie has gorgeous, beautiful animation and set pieces, but it just doesn't feel that exciting. It just seems like it's trying to indulge audiences with its nice set pieces, yet offers nothing else exciting in the long run. I mean, I've mentioned in the past that good animation can't save a weak script. Also, just take a wild guess what the villain wants to do. He's too full of himself, he wants to take all the fame, so he sends an assassin to try and hunt down the trio. How many times have I seen this villain trope before? It's not engaging or funny, it's just there because the movie needs a villain. I always felt the threat of this movie should have been the journey itself, not that some assassin is trying to hunt them down. That's like what How to Train Your Dragon 3 did. However, I shouldn't let people get the impression that I hate this movie. I really don't. Even though the story has been done to death before and the set pieces aren't that exciting, it's not like it was a story that annoyed me. And unlike Wonder Park, there are more nice scenes this time around. Hell, most of the charm comes from the character of Link himself. I enjoy his naivety to human culture, and I admire the reason why he refers to himself as Susan. He also holds some of the funniest gags in the movie, so much so that I actually cared about his goal to find a family. And yes, like I said before, the animation is beautiful. It's amazing how far Laika have come with their character design and movement. You almost swear this wasn't stop motion at all. But unfortunately, as good as some elements of the movie can get, it isn't enough to save it. The honest truth is, if I actually did like this movie, I probably wouldn't have been so disappointed that it won that one award. But in a year where we've had other vastly superior animated movies, I feel this was the weakest film to get that award. I'm all for Laika finally winning an award like this, but it would have felt more earned if it was a movie that I actually liked. Again, I don't think Missing Link is bad, but it's nothing special to make it stand out as one of Laika's best efforts. It's predictable and cliched in a lot of areas, and the good parts aren't enough to make up for how bored I was. If you enjoy it, more power to you, but for me, I'm better off keeping this one a mystery for now. The Secret Life of Pets 2. Great. So we have another one of these movies about animals that seem more like YouTube animal memes at this point. If you recall my original video on the first Pets movie, I initially thought the film was fine, but over time it began to sour on me as being one of Illumination's most unoriginal movies, as its story was a blatant ripoff of the Toy Story movies. Yet literally the only reason this movie exists is because the first one made a lot of money, so it only made sense to do so. As you can imagine, I was not looking forward to this movie at all, but maybe by some miracle it can be better than the first one? Well, let me just say, if you remember that one poster that says "Don't laugh," guess what? It's a metaphor to this goddamn film. What's the story? Oh geez. Tell me if you've heard this one before. The main character Max has to cope with major changes in his life as his owner has gotten married and had a baby. Yeah, and this is shown in the span of a few minutes, people. So now he's become protective of the child, but oh no, he's too afraid. So now he has to get taught by this gruff farm dog on how to be braver. But wait, that's not all. Max's toy has gone missing, and now his friend Gidget has to get it back from a cat lady, which means, oh no, she has to pretend to be a cat. But wait, I'm still not done. The rabbit Snowball has to rescue this tiger from a circus with this new character, and he always has to try to act like he's brave when, oh no, he actually isn't. As you can no doubt tell from the tone of my voice, the stories in these movies are so boring and predictable that I could swear I almost fell asleep during this movie. Oh wait, did I say stories? Yes I did, because Secret Life of Pets 2 decides to copy the same storytelling trope from Sing by having several stories in one movie. Except when Sing did it, it was already terrible, and here it's even worse. I can give Sing credit for trying to tie all the stories into one narrative, but in this, it's literally just 3 different stories that don't connect all that often until at the very end of the movie. What I'm trying to say is, remember some of those terrible Disney sequels that would have like 3 different stories that got tied together to make a movie? That's what they do here, except they try to cover up the element by trying to tie a narrative. As boring as the first film was, at least its subplot was still connected to the main one with the side characters trying to find the protagonist. Here though, nope, nothing at all. Instead it just focuses more on trying to make itself extremely over the top cartoony and pets doing silly things whenever they're on screen. I get this is a children's film, but I don't think that should ever be used as an excuse for the filmmakers to not try hard enough with this movie. Regardless of how badly it wants to keep my attention, it fails so hard. I think I get more enjoyment watching these type of animal videos on YouTube. But big shock, that's not my only gripe with this movie. In fact, it's a problem that's carried over from the first one. The characters are not good. Except here, it's actually worse this time. Because there was one character I liked in the first movie, Gidget. Yet instead of her being a cute yet badass dog trying so desperately to find her love, now she's been reduced to a walking cat impersonator, because apparently the writers thought that was funnier. On top of that, practically everyone is hit with a bad movie trope. Max's owner has a husband and child now, so he's slapped with the overprotective parent trope that made more sense in other movies like Finding Nemo. Snowball gets hit with the I act like I'm brave when I'm really not cliche, and everybody else is really only there to tell jokes and perform bad slapstick. That even includes Duke, who despite his character arc in the first movie just spouts out one-liners and bad toilet humor. And good lord, this movie is not funny. Like, at all. I suppose the only joke I found mildly funny about the movie was how the cat lady is secretly a badass, but that's not saying a lot when generally there are funnier cat ladies out in the animation world. Everything else? Well, it does involve pets, so of course it has to be potty humor. Yep, outside of the cliched attempts to tell jokes such as before comes the tray of badly done toilet humor by the animals. Usual ones like dogs sniffing asses, cats puking up hairballs, or how about some classic comedy gags like, "Aw, Max can't get the ball under the table because he has a cone on his head. You're killing me, movie." I feel as though the writers didn't care enough about this movie and just threw on any kind of joke that they thought of. of, let alone the fact that the character arcs are completely thrown out the window for no reason, like how Max hates kids at first, but instantly loves his owner's child out of nowhere. Great job, writers! Honestly, the only way I could sum this movie up is if you're just going into it wanting to see cute animals do cute things, there's a perfectly good website for that. The Secret Life of Pets 2 offers no interesting characters, no good plot, a tray of cliches, and toilet humor at its base level. It's definitely not the worst movie they've done. I'd rather watch this than Minions, Hop, or The Grinch any day of the week, but it somehow managed to be worse than the first movie. All I can say is, keep this movie a secret, and there may be some sanity in my life. If you're a Toy Story fan who's just getting into these movies, chances are you'll see Toy Story 4 as this unnecessary sequel that doesn't need to exist. Which is exactly how most were feeling when it was coming out. I mean, I love the Toy Story trilogy, so I didn't really see a reason for this to exist. I didn't expect it to be terrible, it's just I didn't see a point for it. The first film is a classic, the second film is one of my all-time favorite movies period, and the third one was still a great time despite being the weakest in the trilogy. It managed to conclude the story with Woody, Buzz, and the gang in a satisfying way that nobody could have ever expected Pixar to make a fourth film. When I finally saw the movie, I still felt like it didn't need to exist, but I found it an enjoyable film from beginning to end. And yes, I will have some unpopular opinions to say about it. Since the events of Toy Story 3, Andy's toys were given to Bonnie and they're having as fun as ever, but Woody is struggling to adapt to a new lifestyle where he's no longer the favourite of the group. So he sneaks into Bonnie's bag on her way to her kindergarten orientation and secretly helps her make a toy out of trash known as Forky. Forky, however, believes he is actually trash and constantly throws himself away, particularly when the family is going on a road trip. Woody also gets separated from the group and runs into Bo Peep after having not seen her for so long. Before anything else, I just want to say that the animation for this movie is jaw-dropping. It almost feels like this entire movie took place in an alternate timeline of the real world. The textures, backdrops, and designs all make for a visually stunning movie, and really shows how far Pixar has come along since 1995 when the first Toy Story came out. If I had to be honest, I think this is by far the funniest Toy Story movie outside of the second film, and I seriously needed a good laugh after how painfully unfunny Pets 2 was. The new characters they introduce excel the most when they're trying to be funny, whether it's Ducky and Bunny's incredible dynamic, Duke Kaboom's overarching backstory, or Forky's existential crisis. Though the fact that Buzz had to rely on his voice box for his subconscious did seem a little odd and not something I'd expect Buzz to do. That said, as funny as the new characters are, with the exception of Forky, they don't serve a whole lot to the story. It just seems like they were added either so Pixar could add more star-studded celebrities to this movie, or they wanted to add more comedy? I don't know, I felt like the humor they already set up from the start was fine enough. I still really enjoyed the new characters, but I couldn't help but feel they were only added to serve as comedy props throughout the film. Even when they tried to give Duke a backstory, it's quickly resolved within a few minutes and is mostly portrayed as a joke. And speaking of characters, Andy and Bonnie's toys don't really play a huge part in the movie, so if you went in expecting to see familiar faces for a good chunk of it, you're gonna feel majorly disappointed. In terms of the new characters, Forky is easily my favorite. I feel as though he's the only one who serves justice to the story and never came across as annoying. But hey, Bo Peep is back, and this is easily her best role in the franchise because at least the filmmakers didn't need to do anything cliche to make Bo seem badass like giving her a sword. She comes across as a complex character who I got to sympathize with very quickly since the start of the film. That's not much given that she didn't get a whole lot to do in Toy Story 1 and 2 aside from simply being there for Woody when needed. And finally there's Gabby Gabby, who actually managed to become my favorite Toy Story villain. Not just because she often manages to have some really creepy atmosphere, I mean her ventriloquist dummies scared the crap out of me, but because she also proves to be one of the most sympathetic villains in animation history, as we get to see her soft side and how desperately she wants to be adopted by a little girl named Harmony. By the time she actually finds a child to keep, I really felt proud of her. But most importantly, I need to talk about Woody, and this is where the big spoilers come in. Throughout the course of the series, it's always been about a toy's connection with their owner, and Woody was no exception to that. He loved Andy, and was initially caring more about being his favorite toy than anything else in the world. Woody has grown so much throughout the series, which is why he's always been my favorite character, since now he's more concerned about making sure his child is happy regardless if he's their favorite or not. Even if Toy Story 4 has less to do with toys being played with, it managed to conclude Woody's arc more flawlessly than I could have ever imagined. He's become much more than a toy to make one child happy. He's allowed to explore the world and make more children happy, which was evident when him and Bo tried to help Gabby introduce herself to a lost child, and even more evident in showing Forky the joy of being loved by a child. Even despite all of that, he decides it's now best to help other children and toys rather than staying with Bonnie and the other toys, and this didn't come across as frustrating to me. And on top of that, let's discuss the ending. The one part of the film that everybody hates or loves to joke about. You've probably seen one comment about how Andy will come back and things will be awkward now that Woody's not there. What's my input on the ending? I actually really like it. Unlike a certain crappy sequel, it was pulled off in a way that made more sense. As I said, it's never about Woody giving up on a child at all, but more that he's giving up on the idea to simply dedicate his life to one child. I know Bo Peep states she's off seeing the world, but it's blatantly established that she still remains to be a toy to multiple children wherever she goes. I mean, why else were the carnival toys reporting about groups of children in different areas? So they can play with them. It's as simple as that. And need I once again bring up Gabby's arc? She had to learn to not just simply dedicate her life to one child, but rather open herself up to other children to find the right one in the end. Woody's choice at the end of the movie reflects that he doesn't always have to be the sole toy that's there for Bonnie. He spent his entire life being Andy's core toy, and despite not being loved as much as Bonnie, still does everything he can to make her happy. His realization at the end is that being given up by one child is a part of a journey that any toy will face. Regardless if you're a toy or human, you always have the chance to explore new things in life. A toy making one child happy isn't their singular purpose. Does it seem weird for Woody to leave the same friends he's been with for years? Sure, but I don't really believe it's a forever kind of goodbye. I mean, if Woody found Bo after all these years, I'm sure they can figure out a way to see Woody again. You know, considering he now travels with a carnival. I just think it's a little unfair to call out Woody for being selfish by leaving at the end. Bonnie moved on from Woody well before Woody moved on from Bonnie, and it makes sense that he would finally move on, because not everybody is going to be Andy. Let's also not forget that Woody kept bringing up Andy subconsciously after all these years because he couldn't let go of Andy while still trying to be there for another kid who barely notices he's there. Sure, that may fly against the ending of Toy Story 3 where Bonnie promised to Andy that she would take care of him, but she is only 5 years old, I'm assuming, and kids do tend to forget certain things. Regardless, Woody ultimately decided to move on from both Andy and Bonnie so he could be with the one person who will always be there for him. Final verdict? If you're so clingy to Toy Story 3 being the final film in the franchise, then you don't need to see this movie. Even as the filmmakers said, it's not really a continuation, but rather a standalone sequel. And as it stands, I really enjoyed Toy Story 4, despite how skeptical I was of the idea that it existed. All I'm hoping for is that Pixar doesn't do a Toy Story 5, as that would feel like even more of an insult to the series. Considering they're focusing more on original films like Onward and Soul after this movie, I'm excited to see where the future takes Pixar and the impact they've continued to bring forward after nearly 30 years. Ooh, what's this? An animated film that's cashing in on a toy product? That sounds like a totally original idea. Well, whoever saw it as original or not, they gave us this, UglyDolls. A film that, even after its announcement trailer, got a wide backlash from audiences, which only got worse when the actual movie came out. Going into it, I was expecting it to be complete garbage like everyone was telling me, but I'm not gonna lie, is this really that bad? Oh, don't get me wrong, it certainly has awful moments in it, but compared to other bad animated films like Minions or Home, I think it's fairly watchable in comparison. I even have an unpopular opinion I want to discuss, but I'll get to that later. In a land known as Uglyville, a girl known as Moxie believes that there's more to life outside of the world that she lives in, so she and her friends venture to a place known as the Institute of Perfection to see if she can find a way to be with a kid. And yeah, that's about it when it comes to plot. Yeah, it's about as stale and generic as you can get. Well, alright, that's not entirely a bad thing, but let me explain. With the plot out of the way, I want to go over the key complaints this movie's gotten and my own input on them. It's pretty obvious that by the way this movie looks, as well as the pop stars and music, it borrows a lot of elements from DreamWorks' film Trolls. And yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. It's pretty shady business to copy from another film when you're also presenting this message about how you don't have to be perfect all the time as long as those love you for who you are. An ugly duckling story, if you call it. I don't have an issue with a familiar story if they can at least keep it entertaining enough. And in terms of this movie, well, the story is extremely predictable, however, it's not unwatchable. Was I annoyed at points? Yes. Were some parts hard to get through? Of course. But I don't know, I feel like there are actually a few things this movie did to, and here comes the unpopular opinion, make it better than Trolls. Yep, you heard right. Whereas everyone says this movie is worse than Trolls, I feel the complete opposite. Why, you may be asking? I'll go over the smaller reasons first. Firstly, while this movie borrows the same colours and cheerful attitude as Trolls, I don't find it quite as unbearable as it could have been. I mean, this is a world filled with ugly looking plushies. What they do is just accept who they are and don't usually make a whole lot of fuss. Meanwhile in Trolls, everyone is too happy and too cheerful that the slightest bit of negativity throws the characters off and it's grating to sit through. And it helps that I tolerate the UglyDolls as well. They certainly aren't good characters. I mean, you have a lot of cliche character tropes like the sassy one or the insecure one, but I could differentiate themselves from each other and see them as slightly more distinct. That said, the villain is awful. He has no significance to the story and serves as a tool, as an obstacle to the protagonist and to help hammer in this movie's message. Though speaking of the message, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm split on the message. On the one hand, I hate how frequently this movie tries to hammer its message in, and it seems hypocritical of the studio to have a message about not being perfect while also stealing elements from other movies, but by God, it's a lot better than Trolls' message. The problem with that film's moral is like a contradiction to the message Inside Out taught, in that instead of embracing your emotions, you have to keep yourself healthy, just be happy 24/7 and don't show any sign of negativity at all. You feeling angry? You feeling sad? Suck it up and be happy. Take our hugs or you're seen as a grouch. It's a contributing factor to why I think Trolls is such an awful movie. For UglyDolls, despite the arguments I mentioned earlier, I think the message is an important one to tell. How you should just embrace your flaws but be willing to be yourself. This even causes the perfect dolls to break order and be imperfect as well. Yes, we've heard this message before, but I still think it's better than what Trolls got across. The animation might just be the best thing about the movie. I adore how stylized it is. The UglyDolls themselves look flawlessly accurate to their actual plushies, and how these worlds are designed contradict each other beautifully. How UglyDolls is made completely out of fabric while the Institute of Perfection has everything looking neat and organized. And when this animation is put to the musical numbers, god damn, it looks so good. That's another thing too. I don't mind the musical numbers either. At least, unlike Trolls, again, the songs feel more original, fun, and inventive instead of just reusing popular songs that kids are familiar with. I want to clear this up and say that I don't think Trolls is this terrible train wreck that deserves to be bashed. I just think differently on the matter. UglyDolls is by no means a good movie. The characters aren't anything special, the comedy isn't that funny, the villain is insufferable, and its message is insanely predictable. How much they hammer it down your throat can get annoying, especially with how hypocritical it can seem. But honestly, looking past all of that, it's fine. It's not this horrible train wreck or the worst of the year, because at least I wasn't entirely annoyed with it and even got some nice things out of it. I even think the ending is really nice, despite how obvious it seemed. I'm not suggesting anyone watch this movie if you need to, but try to go into it with a few higher expectations, because while it's certainly not good, UglyDolls is a movie that is by no means ugly enough to avoid. Alright, I can already hear the argument. Yoshi player, why are you reviewing the Lion King remake? This is an animation. Well, as hard as it is to admit, it technically is. Outside of the first shot, everything in this movie was animated or done with computers. A fact that was even confirmed by the director himself. And you know what? If I can use that as an excuse to review this movie, I'll happily oblige because wow. I don't think I've seen a movie this year that genuinely made me feel depressed. And no, I don't mean that the movie itself made me feel sad. The mere existence of it and the impact it's left is what made me depressed. Because the Lion King remake is one of the most shallow, soulless, empty movies I've seen in a very long time. Simba is the newborn prince of Pride Rock and is soon to become the new king after his father Mufasa, but his brother Scar, who was originally next in line to be king before Simba, schemes a plan with a group of hyenas to kill Simba and Mufasa, by trapping Simba in a gorge with storming wildebeest and throwing Mufasa to his death. Simba manages to escape and leaves the Pride Land with guilt, believing he was responsible for Mufasa's death, and comes across two outcasts named Timon and Pumbaa. They teach him about the philosophies of Hakuna Matata, which changes him into a different person. Meanwhile, Scar has taken over the Pride Lands, turning it into a barren wasteland, and Simba's childhood friend Nala finds him and tries to convince him to take his rightful place as king. And summing up the plot in of itself already creates the first problem with this movie. If it sounded exactly the same as the animated one without any differences, then you're absolutely right, because this movie adds almost nothing new to change the narrative in any way. What I'm trying to say is, if you've seen the 1994 animated film, then you'll probably think me summing up the story was a waste of time. That is the first sign of this movie's laziness, when you know everything I just said can already be applied to the original. I'll at least give the other live-action remakes credit and say they at least added a few new things to make them different from the originals. Doesn't automatically make them good movies, but I can tell they were at least trying some things different. I'm not joking when I say the Lion King remake is practically taking almost all elements of the original and pasting it into a CGI environment. There's barely anything new added to the narrative to make it seem fresh and new again. Considering this movie is 30 minutes longer than the original, that could have given the filmmakers plenty of opportunities to expand on character backstories, to learn more about them, or give off new motivations and set pieces to give us something new to explore. But instead, it's trying to be exactly like the original. How it's paced is the same, how the scenes play out is the same, there are no substantial differences in this movie to make it seem different than the original. And the acting does not hold any other favors. I mean, when you're remaking a movie with these talented actors, you gotta at least recreate the same energy and warmth the original left. But the new actors sound so dead and lifeless with their performances that you swear all of it was just the first take. And even when they try to sound emotional, it sounds too over the top and lacking any kind of emotion that the original actors nailed flawlessly. Even James Earl Jones sounds so tired with his performance. Actually, now that I think about it, if they were gonna bring back James Earl Jones just to appeal to nostalgic fanboys, then why didn't they get some of the other actors back? I mean, I know you couldn't get back Rafiki's voice actor since he passed away, but why couldn't they get Jeremy Irons back as Scar, or Whoopi Goldberg as Shenzi, or Nathan Lane and Ernie Sabella as Timon and Pumbaa? I'll tell you why. It's so Disney can hire these star-studded celebrities that don't fit with these characters at all. Like, who's gonna imagine Nala being voiced by fucking Beyonce of all people? But without any doubt in my mind, the absolute worst element of this whole movie is how soulless and dead it is. Now, I'll admit right off the bat that, yes, the technology for this movie is really impressive. The animators did a very accurate job making this animated project look like real life. But there lies the problem. You're trying to make the animals look realistic, but you're also recreating one of the most emotional and heart-packed films of all time. So now that you're trying to make the animals look real, it sucks out any of the emotion that the characters had. Especially since for about 90% of the movie, they emote nothing beyond their blank and dead faces. Like, yeah, I guess every once in a while there's a tiny bit of expression, but I don't think I can recall a single moment where the emotion left an impact on me. The original's emotion was done well not because it was animated, but because the story was made to fit an animated film. They wanted to have this movie about singing and dancing animals that could get across emotion that real life animals wouldn't, so they had to stick with animation regardless. It was a movie that wouldn't have worked with any other art style because what it set out to do gave The Lion King its emotional crux, but that doesn't work with this live action remake because the photorealistic animals don't fit within a grand story trying too hard to be epic and intense. And this wouldn't be so much of an issue if they could at least make the characters emote more than what they're capable of. I know that would ruin the photorealism the movie's going for, but doing so would get more emotion out of the audience. You're showing this to people, not animals that can appreciate this photorealism. You want to know what's even funnier? Disney have done this over a decade ago, and it worked. I'm of course talking about the Chronicles of Narnia, with its lion character Aslan. While it's true that Aslan doesn't necessarily look real, it doesn't matter. You're supposed to have your characters, whether human or animal, emote whatever they're feeling so that the audience can feel something for them. The director knew that giving Aslan a realistic design wouldn't have worked because it wouldn't play an emotional crux to the story, so they sacrificed some of the realism to make him more expressive, and it worked incredibly well. I mean, if you took the audio out in the Lion King remake, would you ever be able to tell how the characters are feeling? I never got to see the devilish scheme grins that Scar gave, or the over-the-top goofy expressions Timon and Pumbaa gave. Worst of all though, is the goddamn stampede scene. This is supposed to be one of the biggest heart-pounding scenes in movie history because in the original it showcased all the emotions that Simba would be feeling in a situation like this. But here, they don't have him emote anything while he's potentially going to get trampled to death. Hell, when Simba shouted at his father dying, I actually laughed in the audience. Now, are there any differences that don't involve the narrative? Well, kind of, but they actually make this movie even worse. For example, the remake gives a fairly blatant answer to how Scar got that scar on his face because he tried to challenge Mufasa. Okay, so if that's the case, why does every other lion believe him when he says Simba killed Mufasa or that he tried his hardest to save them both? This asshole challenged your king and now you believe he tried to save them? And despite most of the songs being the same, Be Prepared is changed to be insultingly short compared to the original, but the real question is why they even changed it into a speech lasting a few sentences with some uninteresting music playing in the background. They also show off this extended scene of how Nala escaped Pride Rock, but why did we need this? We already knew that she escaped from here in the original through her conversations with Simba. Disney, you don't have to spoon feed stuff like this to us. We're smart enough to figure out these character decisions. But worst of all is the scene when Simba's hair flies to Rafiki, where instead of what I just mentioned, decides to show the hair flying around, landing in a bird's nest, getting eaten by a giraffe, and later shat out into a ball of shit that a little dung beetle rolls around. Another problem with the movie is that the differences are so few and far between that anything positive I could say about this movie can already be applied to the original. Like the soundtrack, for instance. It sounds great, Hans Zimmer really knows how to nail an epic tone, but it also sounded good in the original. Timon and Pumbaa are still funny characters in this movie, but they were also funny and arguably more funny in the original. But you know which scene I think perfectly showcases all the inherent problems with this remake? The Hakuna Matata scene, one of the most iconic scenes in the original movie, showcasing how happy the characters are in their carefree environment, doing a brilliant job displaying each of their personalities, all the while pulling off some beautiful scenery and happy attitude. The remake just has the trio walking in a straight line with no emotion, no beat, no color, just stuff. That's the best way to sum up the Lion King remake. It's just stuff happening. Stuff that in no way gets an emotional impact from me and only exists just to take everyone's money and walk out. I mean, let's be real here for a second. Did The Lion King really need a remake? There was barely anything in it that needed to be fixed, but if Disney is going to remake it, try a new point of view, offer a new interpretation of the story, like a universe where the animals don't talk and simply get emotion across through body language. But of course they didn't do that. Disney had no care put into this movie because all they wanted to do was come in, make fast money, and disappear. Like I said, the original wasn't good because it was animated, it was good because its story was made with animation in mind. You can't tell this same grand story with lifeless looking animals, and worse off, animals that aren't even there in the first place. I know it seems like I'm just shitting on this movie because it's a remake of the original, but that's the exact problem. This movie doesn't want to exist to be its own thing. It wants to exist just to cash in on people's nostalgia, crushing any of the heart, care, and expression that the original had. And considering Jon Favreau, the director of this movie, worked on Jungle Book, a movie that had enough differences to make it stand out from the original and still kept it fresh and exciting, it's all the more obvious why the Lion King remake exists. That's why this movie's existence alone makes me feel kind of sad, that animation isn't such a big deal anymore and that companies can just get away with doing this soulless crap and do nothing else to make it stand out. It's no surprise people are finally waking up and calling this movie out, because they know why it exists. But if you haven't seen this movie yet, I implore you, don't do it. Don't give Disney any more money for this soulless shit show of a remake. Do yourself a favor and go watch the original instead. Trust me, after the bullshit I went through in this movie, watching the original again feels like a fucking ascent to heaven. Is it the worst animated film of the year? It's close, but there's a couple of movies I saw that I consider worse. As a standalone movie, it doesn't do anything compelling, but as a tribute to one of Disney's biggest landmarks in history, it's an absolute disgrace. The Angry Birds Movie 2, the sequel to the surprise hit of 2016 and another addition to the Angry Birds franchise that has still refused to die. The original animated film wasn't anything special to me. It wasn't bad, but it just didn't have anything substantial to make it worth rewatching. I mean, it certainly was a lot better than the Ratchet & Clank movie, but outside of its third act, it didn't really feel a lot like an Angry Birds movie. Which is why, as you can imagine, I wasn't really looking forward to the sequel. I wasn't dreading it, but I just wasn't interested. It was either going to be slightly better or slightly worse than before, but still fitting into the average territory. And how did it turn out? Well, it did fall into the former side of being better, but honestly in a way that I'll never forget. Ever since the first film, the birds and pigs have continued to be at war with each other until the pigs discover that a third island known as Eagle Island exists. They attempt to make a truce with the birds, but Red believes this will ruin his new image of being the island's hero. When both kinds discover that the leader of Eagle Island, Zeta, is planning to turn both islands into her own tropical resort, since Eagle Island is practically frozen, the birds and pigs now have to work together in order to stop her plans. So what about this movie makes it better than the original, you might be wondering? Well, for starters, it's a lot funnier this time around. That's not to say the original didn't have funny moments, but they were far and apart from each other. This one, meanwhile, has good jokes being delivered constantly and are just all-around funny jokes in general. It's mainly the slapstick, verbal humor, and clever timing that get the most laughs out of me. I loved all the ways the group tried to sneak into the headquarters, specifically the scenes where they disguise themselves as a derpy-looking eagle. Seriously, that bathroom scene somehow got the most laughs out of me and I'll never fully understand why. There's even a really funny subplot about a group of chicks going to get their eggs back. While at first it seemed to be going into Ice Age sequel territory with unnecessary cutbacks for cheap jokes, nope, that's not the case. The chicks had some of the funniest scenes in the movie in just all the creative ways they don't get the eggs. One of the best elements in the original, in my opinion, were the characters, and thankfully most of them haven't changed. Well, I'd argue they're a little better now. Red's subplot does remind me a little bit of Ralph's from Ralph Breaks the Internet and how he doesn't want to lose something valuable, but it's handled way better here. Since Red has been living alone for practically his whole life and now he doesn't want to lose that, it makes sense why he'd be acting this way. Chuck and Bomb, while arguably still funny in the original, don't have any moments where I was annoyed by them, but best of all, the new characters are great. The villain Zeta is amazing despite the fact I was never intimidated by her, but I guess that was kind of the joke. Her motivation to do her sinister deeds is pretty funny while also inspiring a good message about how not to handle relationships, and the amount of time she tries to come off as threatening but doesn't always work is funny too. Though my favorite new character is easily Chuck's sister Silver. She's just adorable. I love how much of a foil she is to Red's egotistical nature, and the relationship she builds with him is really sweet. I also really like the theme this movie goes for, and that even if you and your companions seem different from each other, you should still work together as a team. Sometimes putting differences aside and working together can mean something more powerful inside. Is it cliched? A little bit, but I still find it an important message to get across. The animation is also fantastic, and I'd argue even better looking than the original. The slapstick really nails it on the head every time, almost like you're watching a Looney Tunes short. Hell, the director of this movie is Thurop Van Orman, the creator of Flapjack. He really knows how to bring the comedic energy with his characters. And look at the backgrounds. Eagle Island in general just looks gorgeous, almost making it the kind of winter I'd love to live in. Except without seals eating everything, of course. If I had to point out any issues with the movie, it would be that the third act does feel a little bit slow, and around the time I started to zone out. It still got funny moments, but it did follow the same old final act formula that most animated kids films fall into. Plus, while most of the jokes are really funny, obviously not all of them are going to hit. Like the one part where everyone's having a dance battle or they're eating pig snot. I get that this is a kids movie, but you didn't have to have scenes like this. Outside of that, I can easily recommend Angry Birds 2 to people that just want a funny comedy movie. It's not great, obviously, but it has enough good in it to make me say, you know what, I want to watch it again. And in a year where we had a terrible Lion King remake, it's pretty ironic to have a good Angry Birds movie right next to it. Obviously, it's better than the original. It's funnier, has better animation, more likable characters, and a decent moral that kids can get something out of. If you're looking for a fun little kids movie that isn't going to offend anyone, this is a neat one to check out. Abominable is another animated film that adds to this oddly new trend of animation studios putting out movies that star Yeti-like creatures. First there was Warner Brothers that did Smallfoot, a movie I really liked. Laika did Missing Link, which sorry, I still only see as average. And now DreamWorks steps into the ring with Abominable. The weird thing to say about this movie is that it may just be one of the hardest animated movies to talk about. I know that sounds strange, as this is simply just an animated kids flick, but I need to be upfront here. What I'm about to describe about this movie will remind you of one other movie or another. A Yeti named Everest has separated far from its natural habitat, and a wealthy man and zoologist want to use it for their own needs. When he meets a young Chinese girl named Yi, she and her friends decide to help him get back to his home. And that's about it when it comes to the story. Alright, so with the plot out of the way, go ahead and tell me what movies this reminded you of. Well, in my case, when I was watching trailers for this movie leading up to it, I thought, this is kind of like The Iron Giant, isn't it? And right then and there is where the movie begins to fall. The story has been told before in plenty of other children's movies, and the most infuriating part is that even at points where I felt like they were going to throw in a new twist or spark a new creative story beat, it goes right down the same safe generic path that's been done before. Even the dialogue sounds like it's coming from a different movie with the same narrative. Hell, the journey itself bears strikingly similar elements to Missing Link. You know, how the mysterious creature has to journey across to find a family. I know both of these movies were done at the same time, but it cannot be a coincidence. But I feel like there might be a reason why this movie feels very safe and bland. Alongside DreamWorks, this was co-produced by another studio known as Pearl Studio, originally known as Oriental DreamWorks. They were one of the first studios in a long time to import American films to China, starting off with The Croods, but would later co-produce some of DreamWorks' upcoming movies, namely Kung Fu Panda 3, because that movie had Chinese elements, and wouldn't you know it, so does Abominable. Except unlike Kung Fu Panda 3, Pearl Studios were mainly in charge of the story and narrative, which could explain the safe generic direction it took itself. I don't want people to think that China isn't capable of producing a good animated movie, but since Pearl Studios were mainly Chinese distributors and co-producers, having them in charge of an animated movie like this was bound to lead itself into a bland and predictable direction. Or perhaps this story was new to the people at China, so they didn't see it as a big deal. It really sucks too, because I adore this animation. The colors, the textures, the background work, it all just leaps off the screen. But when you're putting this gorgeous animation to a story that's been done before, it makes it all the more disappointing. It doesn't help that the writing just isn't funny. Even with its slapstick, it doesn't feel as well timed and over the top as Angry Birds 2 was. A lot of the jokes are either too juvenile or just come in when they feel like it. Did you ever expect a steak to show up just to go whoop whoop? If you didn't, then this movie isn't for you. And maybe, just maybe, the characters can bring something new to this. I mean, even a movie as painfully average as Sing had some good characters used for its narrative. So does Abominable do that too? No. Well, okay, Everest himself does look pretty cute, probably one of the most distinct Yetis I've seen in an animated movie, but the human characters, don't make me laugh. You've got the young female who's always looking for adventure because her normal life is too difficult, the small chubby one who's involved in slapstick, the one who's always questioning fantasy, and the evil corporate bad guys who want the Yeti just for gold, gold, gold. I feel the reason I found this movie hard to talk about or to add something new that I couldn't have said before is because Abominable, quite frankly, is one of the most safe, generic, unoriginal animated movies that I've seen in a very long time. Like I said earlier, if you've seen The Iron Giant, you've already seen Abominable. Perhaps you could do yourself a favor and just go watch that movie again. Abominable is certainly no awful flick by any means, it's not even really that bad, it's just painfully safe and forgettable. I'll give it this though, DreamWorks did a fine job of delivering something easy to sit through before their real shitstorm hits. When I booked tickets for this year's Addams Family movie, I was going into it hoping to get a good first impression from the franchise, as believe it or not, this is my first time going into anything related to the Addams. Hell, they weren't even a thing I knew about until the trailers for this movie came out, meaning I didn't know if they had any other good shows or movies, but maybe I'll check them out at a later date, especially with how this movie turned out. I'm sure there's probably better media out there for the Addams Family, but this movie really needed a better script. Two newlyweds named Gomez and Morticia are forced to move away with their family after their town disapproves of their nature. They eventually find a new place to live far away from normal humans until a town just randomly shows up and there's this reality TV host that wants to redesign the house to fit with everyone else's. And when that goes wrong, her plan is to use social media to spread false rumors encouraging the town to commit genocide on the Addams house. Trust me, this story has a lot of flaws going against it, but where I want to actually start with this is the animation. The movie was handled animation-wise by Nitrogen Studios Canada, the same company that worked on Sausage Party. As some of you may know, there was some controversy surrounding the studio in which people believe there was harsh treatment and forced overtime caused during the production of Sausage Party. I bring this up in part to mention the impact it left on this movie's animation, and I gotta say, outside of some freakishly looking designs, I think it looks fine. The Addams look distinct from what I've seen in animated media, the movements are smooth, the background layout looks more polished, and here I can believe there was better animation work with less harsh management. Though, like I said, some of the designs, especially with the humans, look outright unfinished. I mean, just look at the main villain's daughter here. Who designed this monstrosity? Seriously, a lot of the humans look creepier than the Addams. In a movie that's supposed to establish how it's okay to be different from the rest of the crowd, it's pretty contradicting to have characters look like this and be seen as acceptable early on. But where the movie really fails given my implications is with the story. There was so much potential to tell a good story with these characters, yet it's wasted on a cliched, tired narrative of how it's okay to be different. The main plot is just Gomez and Morticia trying to host a family gathering with the town and interacting with various people in the town. It doesn't go anywhere, doesn't have any good jokes, and just goes in one ear and out the other. There's a subplot involving Pugsley going through this rite of passage thing just to try and impress Gomez. But this story feels less like a subplot and more like a running gag with no emotional impact. Though the best story by far is with Wednesday's subplot about her wanting to see more of the world after being kept inside the house for 13 years. It does a fairly decent job of showing that despite Wednesday's creepy demeanor, she also shows passion for others and wants to do more in her life other than just staying locked up. But as a whole, the story doesn't carry a lot of weight and isn't very funny. I can accept a bad story if there was at least some funny jokes or good character interactions. Sing pulled it off just fine, so why can't this movie? Because I feel like the characters aren't allowed to show off their true potential. If this is a family not bothersome about the way they act and love being themselves, why are they so nervous about a regular old town? Doesn't that kind of fly against their stance on humanity? Keep in mind, I don't know a lot about that myself since I never saw the other movies. All I could get was some research, but if other reviewers are pointing out this plot thread, then maybe I am right about something. The actual characters are mostly fine, and I do really like the voice acting, but some are worse than others. The villain is literally Smiler from the Emoji Movie, her daughter suffers a cliched story beat, and the Addams do some kooky things every now and then, but their character development doesn't hold much weight and almost comes out of nowhere in the plot they're in. And the story beats are really hard to swallow. So I mentioned before that the villain wants to rid of the Addams family by spreading false rumors about them on social media, and it also results in her downfall considering she was being live streamed. Not only is that a pathetic way to put the villain in their place, but relying on social media as a plot point is going to date this movie horribly. It does have a decent message about how social media can be both harmful but also have good uses, but still. And by the time the villain is defeated and she loses her TV show, what happens? She has an off-screen redemption for no reason other than to tell a joke? Then by the very end of the movie, the house the Addams live in gets painted pink, which apparently is a callback to how the original show had the house painted pink to pop better on a black and white TV, but that was behind the scenes stuff. Why would they make the house look like everyone else's in a movie that's telling you about how it's okay to be different? In all fairness though, there's nothing horrible or unredeeming that the Addams Family movie does to make it a train wreck, but carries no kooky Addams Family-esque nature enough to make it entertaining. And it's all backed up by a really boring story and weak writing. As a viewer seeing this as his first Addams Family movie, I was severely disappointed. I don't know if the other Addams movies are better than this or not, but I really wanted this to be a good movie. I mean, if this studio can make Sausage Party one of the funniest movies of 2016, why couldn't they do something similar with this? It just suffered so much wasted potential. If you enjoy the movie, more power to you, but I'm probably gonna watch the other movies to hopefully get a better time. When I went into 2019, I was expecting some amazing content for animated films, but the downside to that is that a lot of the animated films we did get this year haven't led up to the standards I was anticipating. I mean, every so often there was a Toy Story or a Lego movie to soften the blow, but it's genuinely disappointing to say there weren't a lot. Which is why when I saw Klaus, or Klaus, for the first time, I had nothing more than a sigh of relief. A sigh of relief that even after all the bullcrap I had to withstand this year, a group of people out there came together to make this masterwork. Well, almost a masterwork. Now, I'm kind of breaking the rules a little bit here, as I know Klaus is mainly a Netflix movie, but in some locations it did get a limited theatrical release, so I think I can make an exception. And hey, if they want to put this shit in theaters, then I'm allowed to break the rule at least once. The story centers on a postman trainee named Jesper, who's very lazy and full of himself since his father is very rich. Feeling the new responsibility hasn't reformed him, the father sends Jesper to a rundown place known as Smearensburg to try and post 6,000 letters within the year. Desperate to fill the quota, Jesper discovers an isolated dwelling where he meets an old man named Klaus, played by the legend that is J.K. Simmons. When Klaus finds a drawing from Jesper that was lost from a child, he delivers one of his toys to him. Taking advantage of this, Jesper decides to have tons of kids delivering him messages and making sure he and Klaus can deliver all the presents they request. Going into this movie, I never actually expected it to be a Santa origin story. I certainly knew about the movie's existence, but I didn't watch any of the trailers because, and this is going to sound scummy, I wasn't keen on it at first. I thought from the initial setup it was going to play out like a typical Santa story without a lot of depth. Yet when I actually saw this movie on Netflix shortly after I had just signed up for Disney+, I legitimately called myself an idiot for my initial judgment. This is single-handedly the best looking animated film I've seen all year round, hell, probably of the decade. How in the hell was this put together? Well, for a bit of history, the man in charge of most of it is Sergio Pablos, an animator and character designer behind many of the classic 2D animated Disney films. Oh, and also this piece of shit. His vision on this movie was to not only bring back 2D animation, but to move it forward, upping the ante on character design and using the same effects that CG animated films would usually use, like shading and lack of outlines. When I first saw the movie, I swear part of it was CGI, but when I looked up production of it, my mouth literally dropped. This is all 2D animated? As an animator myself, specifically 2D animated as well, I don't know how the animators managed to create this with just their bare hands. That alone deserves a massive round of applause to the crew. And it helps that the characters are well developed and fun to watch. On my first viewing, I wasn't expecting to like Jesper a whole lot, since he starts out as a stuck-up old rich boy who's generally a dick to other people and only values himself, kinda like the Emperor's New Groove. But then I remembered that, hey, I like Kuzco. He was genuinely funny from start to finish, and his subtle hints of change are effective. Well, that mostly holds true for Jesper too. Despite his dick-headed nature, he is still a very funny and likable character who comes up with all the familiar tropes that Christmas itself is plagued with. And unlike characters like Lightning McQueen from Cars, he doesn't relish on the misery of others for self-worth. He learns to actually work for a change, and although his plan is more self-absorbed than anything, I wouldn't call it mean-spirited. Klaus's character does start out kind of obvious, and if you've seen Ice Age, you probably know what I'm implying, but where he shines is his interactions with Jesper. The two have a genuinely beautiful friendship that really moved me, and they bring the best out of each other. And the side characters stand out too. There's this boats person named Mogans that has this hilarious sarcastic attitude of always baiting Jesper after he does the same to him. I love the townspeople who are in a constant state of war with each half of each other for no reason other than tradition, and that little girl is genuinely adorable in the interaction she has with Jesper and how represented her culture is. It's also refreshing to have a Christmas origin story not follow the same tropes as others usually would. Like, there is no magic in this movie at all. It comes more from children's stories being spread around town and sharing that kind of wonder with those that also bring the joy. That's a wonderful sentiment to the standard Christmas movies we're used to, and it helps develop the characters even more. It also leads to this brilliant scene of teaching kids how to behave, which had me genuinely laughing my ass off. And this is also the funniest animated film of the year as well. Sorry, Lego Movie 2. Just the dry banter between some of the characters and the traditional 2D slapstick they use is incredible. Actually, what I found funniest the most was how the father literally kickstarts this plan of Jesper actually trying to achieve his goal by deliberately sending him to this rundown, screwed up town. Or how about the actual reason the townspeople are fighting? There's no explanation, no sort of misunderstanding, they just do it because they're in an agreement to keep on fighting. Because it's fun? How does this sound so stupid and yet so smart at the same time? So, is the movie perfect? People, I wish I could say that myself, but there's one glaring problem I have with this movie that ultimately didn't need to be there. Considering how I mentioned that Jesper is only doing this to post as many letters as he can, this leads to, you guessed it, the Liar's Revealed story, which is one that I am just sick of. And I genuinely wanted to believe they were going to do something different with it, but no, they don't. It goes about as well as you expect. Character is revealed to be lying, everybody's mad at him, he leaves but comes back trying to save the day. And ultimately, this did not need to be a thing. Shouldn't it just be more about how grateful the crew is for all the impactful things that Jesper has done? No, of course not, because then it wouldn't lead to the obvious climax and character realization. It is a genuine problem that I'm really annoyed by, but compared to everything else this movie has going for, it's not really a big deal. I mean, I'm still astounded by the effort gone into the animation, and every other element works flawlessly. I didn't even mention the ending, which, without giving anything away, was genuinely heartbreaking, but it also makes you feel even happier for the characters. Overall, Klaus is a nearly flawless work of animation that I can easily see being considered a Christmas classic. Personally, I'd even go as far as to call it the best Christmas origin story I've ever seen, and I can't believe how much of an idiot I was for not being keen on it before it came out. Klaus is a beautifully looking, funny, mostly well-told story that will surely inspire animators in the future. If you have Netflix, check it out when you get the chance. I reviewed the first Frozen way back when I first started doing reviews. Initially, I thought the film was pretty mediocre, and that's still pretty much how I feel about the movie today. I'm not one to immediately jump on the Frozen hate train, but I failed to see it as either an incredible or overrated movie. I really like the animation. Love is an Open Door and For the First Time in Forever are two songs I genuinely liked. Anna is a great character, and the story was fine for the first half. However, it really fell apart in the second. The writing wasn't the best, plot holes were all over the place, and the other songs were really bad. Yes, I'm even including Let It Go in that regard. So it's because of my mixed reaction on Frozen that I was actually looking forward to the sequel. I was hoping it would be more serious and story-driven than before. Did it work? Well, all I'll say right now is, did it really get snubbed at the Oscars for not getting nominated? Meh. The film opens up with a flashback to when Elsa and Anna were little kids, where their father tells them the story of their grandfather establishing a treaty with the neighbouring tribe of Northuldra by building a dam in their homeland, the Enchanted Forest. But after a fight occurs, the grandfather is killed, the spirits disappear, and a wall of mist traps everyone. Years later, and by that I mean 3 years after the first one, Elsa begins to hear strange voices calling to her, unintentionally waking the spirits and disrupting Arendelle. So in order to set things right, Elsa, Anna, and their other friends venture off to find the truth about the kingdom's past. And believe me when I say what I just described to you about the plot is the simplest way to sum it up, because much like the first Frozen, it's filled with many types of plot holes that are more jarring to digest and far more complicated than they should be allowed. Now, to the first one's credit, despite all the plot holes it set up, at least it still had a story to tell about a princess trying to find her sister who has ice powers. But here they throw a bunch of plot details at you within just the first few minutes, and it remains this way throughout the whole movie. It's too filled with ideas and has no focus or layers built to make it consistent. For example, one big revelation this movie gets is that it finally explains how Elsa got her powers in the first one. It was simply a gift because her mother saved her father's life. Except, is it really a gift? When at all in the first Frozen did Elsa's powers ever benefit anyone outside of using it to defend herself? I mean, I know she was raised wrong as a result, but it seems a little weird that these ice powers are considered a gift and yet the parents are willing to hide Elsa from the rest of the world. We're talking about the same powers that practically almost killed Anna and potentially put an entire kingdom at risk of dying of hypothermia. I don't want them throwing this gift bull crap at me if you're not going to do anything else to justify how they benefit anyone. Also, they try throwing in a lot of Avatar-esque plot points at us by saying Elsa's powers were part of some fifth element or something. But you guys know that ice power is literally just the same as water, right? Ice is just frozen water. How did nobody notice this? Whatever stake this movie tries to introduce, it's quickly resolved in a few minutes, meaning they're not high enough to sustain my interest. Like, remember in the teaser trailer where Elsa was trying to run across a tidal wave? Gave you the impression she was trying to overcome a struggle. I was thinking, holy shit, this movie's gonna have some real emotional weight. But no, it's not properly built up and feels less exciting than it should be. This movie doesn't hesitate with clashing two different types of tones against each other just to create a confused narrative that feels like it's going nowhere. Not just that, the actual conflict going on with the spirits lost my interest really quickly. This not only leads to a climax that doesn't even feel like a climax, but it just made me question why this was never an issue until the fight only got more physical. There's no stakes involved to keep my interest long enough because by the second the problem is introduced, it's resolved in the easiest fucking way possible. From the first minute this movie began, it became insanely obvious where it was going to go and what the big message of the day was going to be. But by far the most frustrating element of the story, to me at least, is with the ending. I guess it's nice to say there's no twist villain this time around, even though at one point it seemed like they were going to do that, but now the trend is deciding to split up main characters before the movie's over. Ralph Breaks the Internet did it pretty badly, but Toy Story 4 did it great at least. I'm seriously considering whether this or Ralph 2's ending is worse. It's not set up properly, it comes off as forced, and doesn't get explored enough. As much as I hated Vanellope's decision decision for leaving her own game in Ralph 2, at least that aspect was given some attention so that it wasn't some end film decision. When in Frozen 2 did Elsa ever get the idea to live in the forest with the other spirits? I get that she doesn't fit in with Arendelle very well, but all the writers had to do was explore this element a little more. Let alone the fact that Anna now has to become queen and she doesn't react to it at all. I'm fine if they want to develop Elsa more, but it's too rushed. Oh, and I'm sorry to any die-hard Elsa fans out there, but even after how I felt about her in the first movie, I still don't like her. I was extremely hopeful she would be better handled in this one compared to the first Frozen, but what Elsa suffers this time around is that her conflicts are never really resolved. They have an internal conflict set up for her to commonly push people away from her, but it never feels like it was resolved. Instead, it feels more like as if Anna should just accept that Elsa will do this because she doesn't feel like she fits in. When it got to the point where Elsa actually pushed Anna and Olaf away just to explore the island on her own, it actually started to make me legitimately angry. The point is, Elsa is a character I want to like in this series, but I keep getting too frustrated with her to enjoy her. And the other characters aren't much better, honestly. Olaf is really annoying this time around. I didn't really mind him that much in the first movie since a lot of his dialogue was usually really quiet and he was just introduced halfway through. Here he's in it for a good chunk of the movie and he's really loud and painfully obnoxious. Yes, the one part of him doing this stage show of the first movie's events is really funny, but that doesn't say how much I wanted to burn him alive. And all the new characters this movie introduces just aren't very interesting, mainly because they don't get a lot to do. I felt like they were only on screen for about 10 minutes before being cut out of the second half for a good majority of the movie. The only character I felt actually got better was Anna. That's not much of a surprise, I know, but now she's grown past the whole loving someone in a single day shtick and feels more developed this time around. I like how they add more depth and flesh out Anna's character more to the point where she's more than just the one sister that doesn't have magical ice powers. But if I had to say one thing about this movie that is actually better than the original, it is without a doubt the music. Whereas the first movie had a few decent songs and then others that felt like slogs, this movie had more songs that I actually enjoyed more than outright hated. Kristoff has this boy band song which was great, Into the Unknown is a real jam, Show Yourself fits beautifully within the story, Anna's song is really nice. Probably the only song I didn't care for was Olaf, since it felt very similar to In Summer from the original. Otherwise, the songs are way better than in the first movie at least. So in conclusion, I can't really say Frozen 2 is good or bad, it's fairly in the middle. I admire the music, the animation is fantastic, some of the characters are good, and the voice acting is top-notch stuff, but this is all buried within a story that's trying to throw in too much for an overall narrative that I felt wasn't properly planned out. At the very least, it's not as much of a train wreck as Ralph Breaks the Internet, but it's a miracle that the first one actually managed to be better than this. If this and Ralph Breaks the Internet are anything to go by, it's that Disney should probably stay away from making sequels, since I feel they can't make sequels as good as DreamWorks or even Pixar. Sure, they may have done that decades ago, but you know something's wrong here when there's more good Disney DVD sequels than theatrical Disney sequels. If you enjoy it, then continue to enjoy it, but for now I'm gonna need some ice for my headache. Alright, so before I start this review, I want to make an apology. Not to anyone watching this or anyone who saw the movie, but to the Emoji Movie. I am so sorry. For the longest time, I prescribed you as one of the most soulless, cynical animated movies I've ever seen. Well, you can rest easy now because another movie took your place. Playmobil, the movie. I hate this movie. Seriously, I hate this movie so much, I think I'd put it below Arctic Dogs in terms of this year's animated films. Of course, it's not the worst animated film I've seen. I mean, I don't even think the Emoji Movie is one of the worst, but something about this movie rubbed me in such a wrong way that it started to make me angry. Except, this shouldn't be as bad as Arctic Dogs, should it? Well, it found a way to do it. I couldn't have imagined. Alright, so what's the story? Well, it's about a girl and her little brother loving to play with Playmobil, but things go sour once it's revealed their parents died in a car accident, and trust me, I'll be getting into that later on. The two later end up getting transported into the world of Playmobil, and now the girl must venture on this quote-unquote epic and huge quest to save her brother and return home. So let's address the key complaint this movie has gotten. I mean, I don't even have to name this movie to remind you of what it's trying to be like. The Lego Movie, obviously. In all fairness, Playmobil was always seen as a poor man's version of Lego, except it focused more on being simple and childlike in comparison, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So what's the problem then? Well, not only does this movie feel very similar to the Lego Movie, but it deliberately goes out of its way to be the Lego Movie, and it is not at all subtle with how it presents itself. The tone is over the top and silly, except it doesn't want to use it as a benefit or to establish its own identity, it's just doing it because the Lego Movie did it. Except in that movie, it was more self-aware and clever with its jokes. Here it's just telling random jokes because the Lego Movie did it. Except copying the same formula is not automatically a good thing. And this could not be even more evident than with the animation style. Now, I'll admit, the animation itself is actually alright. It doesn't look amazing by any means, but there were some nice backdrops and fast-paced action that it can get just a tiny bit of praise. Except, for a movie about toys, it's not self-aware with that either. The characters move too fluidly and don't show any kind of plastic textures and just act like any character would normally do in an animated movie. Guys, if you're trying to be like the Lego Movie, why not actually follow the same animation style as the Lego Movie? If not, it makes you look lazy and uninspired. Uninspired is another thing too. The worlds this Playmobil universe inhabit are so bland and forgettable. Of course this action-packed adventure is gonna have places like desert and fantasy and medieval. Yeah, I'm sure they have names, but I gave little shits to even remember. Like, if you're going to make this movie seem more epic and action-packed, try to make it more exciting and memorable. And don't even get me started on the story. Good God, it is so horribly handled. Just ignore the fact that this movie is trying to copy the Lego Movie for a second and take a look at how messed up this story is. It has absolutely no focus. Anytime they try to shove the characters into some new environment or lore, it has no explanation at all. How did the girl and her brother end up in the Playmobil world? Random shit, never explained. Characters going into an out-of-place future world? Yep, never explained. Things just happen because movie. And the plot points are so randomly executed and so insultingly bad that I actually laughed at how stupid it was handled. We see the girl and her brother together, a random pop song comes out of nowhere, suddenly a cop shows up and tells them that their parents died in a car accident. Yep, no build up, no suspense, just happens because plot point. And you know you've done something so horribly wrong here when a plot point has me laughing instead of feeling emotional. Are you trying to be The Room now? But wait, it gets better. So now the girl has to watch her little brother and her dream to explore the world is gone. Her brother acts like a total dipshit and says, "You died along with our parents." To which I say, "Fuck you, kid. I genuinely hoped you'd get eaten alive by the T-Rex, you ungrateful fuckhead." And then the movie addresses that the girl lost her playful attitude since her parents died. Fair enough, but then they seem ashamed that she lost it. Well, no shit, Sherlock. Her parents died. What else did you expect? World War III to happen? By the way, did I mention earlier that this movie had a pop song? Yes, I did. This movie is a musical, which not only meant my eyesight was injured, but my ears could bleed as well. They're all forgettable, don't sound catchy, and mostly consist of K-pop songs. Great, they took notes from that awful song from the Loud House, didn't they? And good lord, this movie has some of the most unlikable and annoying characters I've ever seen from a big budget production. I mentioned earlier that the little brother is a piece of shit, but his big sister is no better, especially when you realize how far she's willing to go just to save her brother, and the two guys that join her, I couldn't remember their names. They just serve as generic comic relief that either remind me too much of the dumb, stupid character trope, or the guy that has all the cool gadgets. Oh yeah! Just like the fucking Lego Movie! What is wrong with this movie? I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It doesn't care. Bare and simple. I think that's the reason it ended up rubbing me the wrong way. The fact that it tried to go out of its way to copy the Lego Movie, have no focus on any of its world or character building, and do nothing else creative with the format. Even if it had a more simple plot with different writing and stable humor, it would have immediately been better than what we got. But no, it tried to be the Lego movie, and the simple fact that it doesn't care about what it wants to be or how it wants to do it just feels so dirty. Despite how bad they were, the Emoji Movie was better because it used something different from Lego despite how unoriginal it was, and Arctic Dogs was better because it had just the slightest bit of focus. Hell, even the Lion King remake was better than this because it was simply just trying to recapture the same magic as the original. It didn't work, but it tried. The Playmobil movie doesn't have any of those distinctions to make itself stand out, all the while frustrating me with its desperate attempts to be the Lego movie and having no redeemable qualities at all. If you've seen the Lego movie already, then you've done yourself a favor. In fact, I'm gonna go rewatch that now to clear this movie's shit taste from my mouth. And while I'm at it, where's the ear doctor? Those K-pop songs made my ears bleed. Hey, you want a real good reason to go and watch The Queen's Corgi? Donald Trump is in this movie, and he's represented just about as well as you can imagine. That's totally gonna keep this movie timeless, isn't it? Don't take this as a political video, guys. I have nothing else to say about Trump other than he's voiced by the current Shadow the Hedgehog guy. Anyway, about the movie. And I didn't even realize it had a theatrical release in some countries, including mine. Instead, I watched the movie online with no excitement, and yeah, that sounds just about right. The Queen's Corgi isn't the worst movie to come out of the year. I mean, this has nothing on Arctic Dogs and the Playmobil movie, but I continue to ask how this even got a theatrical release in the first place. The story centers on one of Queen Elizabeth's corgis named Rex. He's enjoying high pride at the palace alongside the other corgis that live there. But one day, the big man himself shows up with his own corgi and they want to make them mate for some sort of relationship growth? I can't remember. Anyway, he freaks out, runs away, and is pushed off a bridge by one of the other corgis known as Charlie. Oh, another asshole with that name. Rex is taken to a dog pound and meets these other dogs that aren't quite as wealthy as him, and I think you guys get the picture. But okay, enough with the story for now. Can I just talk about how fucking weird this movie is? I mean, not just how they interpret Queen Elizabeth and Trump, but Trump's corgi isn't just in love with Rex, she's portrayed as a rapist, and the movie plays it as a joke. In a movie meant for kids. Oh, and that's not the end of it. There's plenty of moments in the movie with really out-of-place romantic gestures for a bunch of dogs. There's a fighting ring in this movie. They really aren't trying to hide some of the sick realities of the world. And that dog Charlie is a goddamn psychopath. Like, he doesn't just want to kill Rex by drowning him in ice. When he gets piled, he sets the pile on fire to let him die. I'm not gonna lie, with all the weird and out-of-place elements this movie had, I was actually interested in seeing where it would go, but I knew that would be a mistake. The actual plot itself is nothing I haven't seen before. Dog valuing himself more than others? Seen it. Psychopathic brother wanting to kill him? Seen it. Rich dog thrown into an uncomfortable environment and learning to respect others? Seen it. It's ironic how this movie has a vaguely similar story to Secret Life of Pets, and it feels like a rip-off ripping off a rip-off. Is it as bad as Secret Life of Pets? Well, yeah, it is. Actually, it's even worse. I mean, that doesn't change the fact that Life of Pets is still a bad and boring mess, but this movie had a lot of parts that feel really out of place for a kids movie. I mean, have I not made myself clear with the rapist dog? The fact that a movie is portraying rapists like that as a joke feels very uncomfortable and dirty. When Rex is thrown into the river and drowning to death, it's drawn out and very unnerving. And to seal the deal, there's a bully dog known as Tyson who constantly beats the shit out of Rex and says things like, "I'll deal with her later," about his girlfriend. Did a children's movie just imply domestic abuse? I'm all for an animated movie cramming in some adult jokes, but Jesus Christ, be more subtle about that and don't mock real life scenarios. That's kind of disgusting. Unfortunately, the characters aren't much better. Rex is not likable in the slightest. He's always claiming he is the Queen's top dog, being too posh and whines like a baby a lot of the time. I already mentioned Charlie and how fucked in the head he is, but the Tyson dog isn't much better. Taking out that distracting, abusive relationship insinuation, he's just a standard bully character, only there to make things worse for the protagonist and having no personality or redeeming qualities at all. The characters are about as bland and generic characters you can get. They're really ticking off a checklist for an animated movie, aren't they? The animation is the only redeeming aspect. Well, kind of. It's not good. The characters look a little blocky in their designs, especially the dogs, but I like the human animation, particularly on Prince Philip and Donald Trump. It's got nice backgrounds, especially in Buckingham Palace, and the lighting is alright. It's not a terrible looking movie, but nowhere near as atrocious as Norm of the North 2 or Arctic Dogs. And that's about all I can say about this movie. You can get an idea if this movie is for you or not, but if you have kids, I wouldn't suggest showing them to this at all, especially with how it pokes fun at rapists and abusive relationships. I feel like if I was a kid watching this, I'd probably feel a little freaked out myself. Kids aren't stupid, you know, they will notice when something seems off. The Queen's Corgi certainly isn't the worst animated movie of 2019, but it's something that ultimately didn't need to exist or probably would have been better off just released straight to DVD. Never thought I'd experience another Duck Duck Goose type movie, let alone one that's actually worse than that movie. Spies in Disguise, the first Blue Sky movie to be released by Disney after they bought Fox in March 2019. When the trailers were coming out for it, I genuinely wanted it to be an outstanding hit. Blue Sky movies have always had the problem of not standing out or feeling too safe in the movies they release, and the overabundance of Ice Age sequels didn't help things either. The only exception to this I feel was with the Peanuts movie in 2015, which is their best movie by far. The second reason is because I actually wanted Will Smith to be in a good animated movie, because the last one... I mean, never mind, what the fuck am I talking about? That's probably just made up garbage. Anyway, what's going on this time around? Will Smith plays a beloved spy known as Agent Sterling, who ends up getting framed by a terrorist and turns to a lab technician named Walter, played by Tom Holland. Sterling wants him to make a device that can make him disappear, but instead he gets transformed into a pigeon. And already that concept of Sterling being turned into a pigeon was worrisome. At first. I'm getting pretty sick of talking animal comedies, especially since it's a field Blue Sky tends to play into when making a movie like this. I mean, you have a talking pigeon trying to be a spy, you can't get more generic than that. However, when I came out of the theater after the movie was over, I had to ask myself, did I enjoy it more than I was supposed to? Was it a guilty pleasure in the long run? In my conclusion, no, it wasn't. Spies in Disguise does have a lot of good things going for it, in a way I didn't think would be pulled off so well. It's not perfect, obviously, but it's another sign that Blue Sky is still capable of making good original movies when they're not wasting their talent on another Ice Age sequel. First, let's start with the star himself, Will Smith as Sterling. At first glance, I actually wasn't expecting to like his character, given the signs of him being over-glorified and loved by everyone. I kept thinking, oh boy, he's gonna be another Lightning McQueen, isn't he? But actually no, Sterling is one of the better examples of how to write a jerk character. Well, in saying that, Sterling isn't actually a bad person who takes pride in making others miserable, he's just a very natural guy who nails what he can do. And we do get to see that he is a compassionate man who wants to do a lot of good. Even his story arc of learning to accept help from others, even the weird ones, is strangely effective and carries the mood of the story brilliantly. Tom Holland's character Walter is also really likable. He's kind of like the Ferdinand of the movie, more of a role model to boys that you don't have to take pride in being tough and brave. You can still do great things with usage of what you love and taking your unique attributes as an advantage to help others, whether good or bad. And of course, Tom Holland does a wonderful job bringing this character to life. Even the villains felt more unique than I felt they would. Like, first I thought they would just come off as the cliched bad guys who want to kill the protagonist and take over the world, blah blah blah, but unlike other villains that tainted our screens this year, these ones actually have layers to them. The villain is not meant to be seen as sympathetic, which perfectly goes with the themes of violence not always being the right solution to a traumatic situation. There's also this group of agents trying to track down Sterling, but the movie never frames them as being stupid or lightheaded, they just simply don't understand what's going on. And if anything, they're just doing their jobs as agents. They're probably some of the most likable antagonists that I've seen in recent time. The movie also does an excellent job with its message on how violence isn't always the answer, that fighting fire with fire can make more people worse than expected. And with the cute character interactions plus light-hearted attitude, Spies in Disguise never really goes too preachy with its message. It never has some stupid breakup moment where someone explains why they're so selfish or some guilt trip that another movie didn't need to do. It just has the audience naturally learn it as it goes along, which is what you should always do for a movie, hinting at resolutions and making the audience think about what they're getting out of it. It also has some really damn good writing. Not every joke lands, but most of them do, and I got a fair amount of belly laughs out of it. I'd say my only hang up with the movie is that it doesn't really know when to slow down. Spy stuff having action is a standard, but having fast-paced animation for a good 60% of the movie can be very off-putting. It almost feels like junk food for a child's mind. Now, it's still action-packed and delivers on good laughs, but sometimes we should be allowed to appreciate some of the background work or lands that the characters explore. But then all of a sudden the animation is moving lightning bolt ray and it's just kind of obnoxious. But despite that one small gripe, I had a blast with Spies in Disguise. It's nothing groundbreaking or revolutionary, but it's always nice to have a funny, action-packed, light-hearted movie to ease your tensions and not give you a headache. It's well animated, the music is cool, the characters are very likable, it's one of the biggest surprises of 2019 and in all the right ways. It may seem more like a neat little treat than something so powerful, but sometimes that's all you need.
That's hot!
Let's cap off this year's animation explosion with Farmageddon, a Shaun the Sheep movie. Being a fan of Aardman and the Shaun the Sheep franchise, I had a lot of high hopes for this movie. The first Shaun the Sheep movie was a breath of fresh air, a simple and humble movie without a lot of dialogue and delivered on plenty of laughs. My only question with Farmageddon was, what took it so long to come out? I believe it was originally going to come out in April of last year, but then it got delayed like twice, and then over in America it only got a Netflix release? Well, either way, the movie did release in both UK and Aussie theatres, so that gives me the opportunity to discuss it. Was it as good as the first one? Let's find out. Now, I'll go right off the bat and address that this movie's story isn't all that original and is bound to remind you of at least one or two alien stories. It's about Shaun finding a lost alien on his farm who's trying to get home to her parents, while the farmer opens up a theme park in an effort to exploit the UFO hype going on. It sounds very familiar to E.T., doesn't it? How the main character is trying to return an alien home before the authorities find out. But if there's one thing I took in from the first Shaun movie, it's that even if a story doesn't feel fresh or new, where a movie should get its value from is with the writing and characters. Enough so to make a predictable story feel fun regardless. And thankfully, Farmageddon does just that. One of the most powerful aspects that's carried over from the original is that there's no dialogue. Most of it is just gibberish, which not only adds to how funny this movie can be, but really proves that a story can be told more through visuals and body movement rather than excessive talking, which makes it easier for everyone to understand what's going on, and Aardman always nails that aspect in this universe. You don't always have to keep kids' attention by waggling over the top shit in their faces or a whole bunch of verbal diarrhea. What this movie does to deliver its story is as perfect as can bloody be. And like I mentioned earlier, it's still just as funny as the last one too, mainly boiling down to good slapstick and small attention to detail. It also has a pretty good message on responsibility. Can you see it coming from a mile away? Yeah, since early on it shows that Shaun is getting sick of all the strict rules that Bitzer has set on the farm, but he learns what it means to be a responsible person through his interactions with the alien Lula, and he does suffer the consequences of his actions when he has no limits on what she can do. We also know that Bitzer is only having strict rules just so he can keep Shaun and the flock safe from danger, but the real power of these fairly predictable morals is just the warm fuzzy feeling of happiness that plays out in many areas. This movie is so charming that it keeps me wanting to live there. Even the villain, despite her obvious goals of wanting to find the alien, is actually pretty sympathetic when we learn her backstory about being bullied just because she believed in aliens. She's still very threatening as a villain, but gets the right resolution she deserves that is thankfully not played off screen like the Addams Family. The animation is still fantastic, and I stand by that stop motion animation continues to evolve with the times and prove how good they can look with the right time and effort is put into it. Every little bit of detail that's presented is charming, the characters, especially the new ones, still look simple and quirky, the slapstick fantastic, it's fast-paced and well done, the set pieces are great to look at. Aardman is one of those studios that I know care most about visual storytelling and unique art style, giving them the unique charm that they've always had. And when it comes to the alien technology, the spaceship and how it manufactures, it's just beautiful. And that's really about all I have to say about Farmageddon. It's a very simple, at times painfully simple movie, but it knows exactly what it wants to do and runs all the way with it. I can definitely say Aardman stepped their game up after their last movie was kinda average. I may not like Farmageddon as much as the first Shaun the Sheep movie, but it still packs amazing animation, likable and funny characters, excellent gibberish humor, and good morals for kids to learn. It's everything cute you would want in a children's movie, and in all the best ways. If you have kids and they want to see this movie, I'll say that you won't be disappointed. By popular vote, it's Sausage Party. Ah yes, one of the few animated films in history to receive an R rating, or MA in my country. It's not often the kind of genres generally aimed at a casual audience get a film that's not only not meant for kids, but even got a wide release, by Sony of all people. Adult animation has been nothing new, but it's a breath of fresh air to have one coming to theaters. Yeah, it's safe to say a lot of animation junkies like myself were looking forward to this movie when it was coming out. I mean, most movies from Evan Goldberg and Seth Rogen are usually great, but in recent times, this movie's kind of been getting a bit of a backlash for more reasons than one. Is the movie that bad to begin with? In a world where food occupy the store markets and hope to get taken to the great beyond by humans, Frank, voiced by Seth Rogen, and his sausage friends can't wait to go home with a happy customer. But after an incident occurs and causes Frank and his girlfriend Brenda to separate from the group, Frank learns the horrifying truth that he and his friends actually become meals to the human when they are taken away. No shit. After warning his pals about their similar fate, the panicked perishables devise a plan to escape from their human enemies. So, right off the bat, people have accused this movie of using talking food as a bit of a gimmick, since so many animated films star inanimate objects or mystical creatures as main characters. It's apparently a sin to put that in an R-rated film where everyone swears and sexual references are spread across the board. But I, for one, find the concept of this movie really clever. Considering how we used to have plenty of commercials with talking food, this movie almost feels like a satire on how food would actually be feeling if they were being devoured, offering a humorous excuse to offer some gore and sex jokes but not making it seem too grotesque either. I might have gotten sick of adult animation always relying on the same old sex jokes and shock value, but thankfully Sausage Party delivers most of its humor in a clever, original, and well-executed way. I would normally take an issue with this if the movie itself wasn't funny, but it is. It is a very funny movie. And now that I think about it, the story of this movie is really well done. A lot of people have pointed out that the movie has a lot of religious themes to it, about how the food call the humans gods and want to be chosen to go to the great beyond. I can at least understand where the criticism is coming from, but for me personally, the religious themes didn't bother me that much. I actually like the direction the movie takes with this, in how the food decide to rally against the humans after discovering the truth, basically going against their organized religion, since before, everybody had to follow the rules in order to go to the good place. Some might see that as a metaphor to not trusting God, but the movie's just satirical enough for me to say that it's not a huge problem. And I mean, come on people, it's a movie about talking food. Are you actually trying to take this shit seriously? Really, if you're too offended by this movie's adult themes and dirty humor, then just don't watch it. It's rated MA for a reason. I mean, there is literally a scene towards the end of the movie where the food, let's just say, engage in a sort of special activity. Now, I don't think the movie as a whole is amazing. There is one thing about it that I'm not willing to defend, and that's the animation. It's not that it's particularly bad per se, but I mentioned during my review of the Addams Family that the studio who did that film also did this, except the production of this movie was when animators were unfairly treated and forced to work overtime without extra pay. That's pretty nasty behavior of the crew, and I think anyone who puts into effort like that should be rewarded more than what what they got. I'm also not crazy about the villain in this movie. It's not that he's a bad character, some of his lines can be pretty funny, but the movie is already dealing with the crisis of humans devouring food. Did it really need a villain to carry out more suspense? And that's really all I have to say about this film. Regardless of its problems, I still think Sausage Party is a great time. I don't care if people are too scared to go into it, that's their problem, not mine. I certainly can see the issues within the cracks, especially with the treatment of the animators, but the well-executed story, likable lead characters, and fantastic comedy are enough to make this movie a huge standout for animated films of 2016, and I'd rather watch this than something like Kubo and the Two Strings any day of the week. Yeah, I said it. And if you're not bothered by this movie's adult themes and religious storytelling, give it a watch. Just be prepared for some pretty intense scenery. By popular vote, it's Shrek 2. I almost get the feeling I'm gonna keep doing Shrek reviews during these voting months, and I don't know how I'm gonna handle that. Anyway, I liked the first Shrek quite a bit. It had its problems, like the cliched misunderstanding plotline, but was ultimately a pretty enjoyable satire on the Disney formula, and delivered it in a way that still made it a respectable and entertaining experience. Shrek 2, on the other hand, is probably one of the best animated sequels I've ever seen. I'm not gonna hide that opinion from the start. I genuinely love this movie, even more than the first one. Everything the first movie did, I think this one does even better, while also introducing new things to make it stand out. Shortly after the events of the first movie, Shrek and Fiona have gotten married and living peacefully during their honeymoon, but their return home is cut short when it turns out they have to visit Fiona's parents in order to get their blessing. Naturally, both of them are stunned to learn that Fiona not only stayed as an ogre, but married an ogre. The father, Harold, voiced by John Cleese, is particularly frustrated with this revelation and hires an assassin to kill Shrek. The assassin, who turns out to be Puss in Boots, voiced by Antonio Banderas, eventually joins forces with Shrek to make up for his attempted assassination. It turns out that the fairy godmother and her son Prince Charming actually want to seize the throne and have Charming marry Fiona instead of Shrek. So Shrek not only has to find a way to earn the parents' blessing, but also make sure that he and Fiona are meant to be. Okay, so what is it about this movie that makes it, in my opinion, better than the first one? Well, for starters, I love how it's a story that actually continues from the first film, and it continues with Shrek's whole identity crisis. I remember how in the first movie he said that nobody can really trust him and he doesn't see himself as worthwhile, and while he's earned both a friend and love interest in the process, he's still got an entire kingdom left to accept him. He questions if he himself is even good enough to be Fiona's husband. What will the world think of him married to a princess? The fact that he even goes out of his way to try and look like a human and risk everything he loved doing in the swamp because he thinks it'll benefit everyone is a really noble move on Shrek's part. I also love how this movie expands on the universe of Shrek. The first film in of itself was a solid foundation of the kind of world this movie gives us, but Shrek 2 really goes above and beyond in expanding the world. As of this movie, Far Far Away becomes the main location, and even that itself is filled with all sorts of fantasy style locations, like a rundown bar called the Poison Apple where all the villains go, and a factory filled with tons of potions and magical spells, really putting the magic of Shrek front and center, ultimately making it more interesting to even look at than the first movie. On top of that, the new characters introduced this time around are fan favorites for a reason. People have already said enough about Puss in Boots that I can't even think of what else to add. He's just a really funny and well animated character. The royal parents are great, particularly the father. He and Shrek have some pretty funny interactions, especially during the dinner scene, but he's also not unlikable either. You know he's too bothered by the fact that Fiona married Shrek, but you also know that he's willing to take a fall just to make his daughter happy, and later does show Shrek respect when he tries to save her from a forced marriage. And of course, the villains are phenomenal. Fairy Godmother is literally behind everything in this movie, and the fact that she comes up with her plan so quickly and subtly manipulates Shrek into thinking about his flaws is both brilliant and kind of scary. And Charming works well as a secondary antagonist, I repeat, secondary antagonist, to bounce off of his mother. There's a lot of other things that are better than the first one as well. The soundtrack and the placement arrangements of each song work flawlessly into the story, the animation is a step up both character-wise and background-wise, and of course, the humor is just fantastic. I laughed out loud on multiple occasions during this film, more so than the first movie. The delivery from everyone comes out perfectly, the pop culture references are well thought out and fit within the world of Shrek, and even some of the performances got a laugh out of me. The climax? Do I even need to describe it? It's suspenseful, emotional, hectic, funny, clever, everything. It's my favorite DreamWorks climax in history, full stop. I can't think of another DreamWorks film that ends the movie so perfectly. Honestly, what else can I even say that hasn't already been said about this movie? Shrek 2 is amazing in so many ways that it was really difficult to even pick any issues I had, and if I did, they'd likely be nitpicks and nothing more. While Shrek 2 isn't my favorite animated sequel period, it's still one of the best. Everything about it works brilliantly, and I have no doubt that Shrek 1 fans will love it. If you haven't seen it yet, do yourself a favor and check it out. You won't be disappointed. By popular vote, it's Dick Figures the movie. Ah yes, hearing that name really does bring me back to the older days of YouTube where my channel was less than average. I used to be a big fan of Dick Figures during its production days, but as time's gone by, I've realized Dick Figures as a series really wasn't as good as it would seem. A lot of its writing and jokes have aged horribly, and while I gotta give props to the animators for managing to make stick figures of all things expressive, the actual characters have aged as well as expired milk. I don't want to sound like an egotist, but there's a lot of things that Styx does nowadays that I wish Dick Figures would have done. Either way, we're here to talk about the movie, one of the few animated films to be crowdfunded on Kickstarter. I used to love this movie back then, but as time's gone on, I began to grow a bit of a disdain towards this movie. So 7 years have passed since it came out, and what do I think of it today? Well, the old Styx movie isn't the only reason I wanted to do a remake. In this movie, we're introduced to two best friends named Red and Blue, who have been friends since kindergarten and typically like to get themselves into trouble. One day, Blue realizes that his girlfriend Pink's birthday is coming up and wants to get her a present. The two run into a raccoon, who's literally named the Raccoon, who tells them that if they can bring him an ancient sword from a long time ago, he'll give Blue the perfect gift for Pink. So the two set off on a grand adventure, and truths are discovered that test their friendship. Alright, so it's actually pretty hard to talk about an indie movie like this, as I know full well that the people behind it did put in a lot of hard work to even get this movie done, and this took less than a year to finalize, so I can't begin to imagine how hard it must have been for the crew to work on it. So in that sense, I should start by giving this movie the biggest praise it deserves, the animation. I mean, yeah, when you really dive into it, it isn't the most impressive work out there, but considering this movie had just 14 artists and animators, I think the work actually done for this movie's art style is impressive to say the least. It's a huge step up from the web series in almost every way. The movements are more smooth, lip syncing feels more natural, the backgrounds are well designed, and all of it together really gives the movie that kind of cinematic feel that it really needed. The voice acting for the most part is also pretty solid, with some obvious standouts being Eric Bowser as the villain Lord Takagami, and Ben Tuller having an absolute blast with Lord Tourette's. That's actually as far as I can go in terms of positives. The rest of the movie is either mediocre or flat out not good at all, like the friendship plotline itself. I honest to God don't find anything appealing or emotional about it. Throughout the course of watching Dick Figures, I never got the impression that Red and Blue were actually friends, and feel more like bad roommates who can't stand each other. And I know this movie's main focus is to address why these two are supposed to be friends in the first place, but all this does is add an unnecessary layer of conflict to the movie when it really would have been better off without it. A lot of scenes focusing on Red and Blue's chemistry feel more forced and less natural like they're supposed to be. It doesn't do anything to convince me that they would work well as friends. And even when we get to the emotional resolution, it comes right out of nowhere as the build-up has Red imagining of several ways to drop Blue into the octopus's mouth, and then all of a sudden Red wants to be his friend. I'm sorry, but how am I supposed to care about these two being friends if it does such a terrible job at the build-up or resolution? But the other main issue with the movie's friendship plotline, which is actually my main problem with the movie in general, it's that Red is such an abnormally uncaring douchebag and probably one of the most unlikable protagonists I've ever seen in an animated movie. I've said it once and I'll say it again. A jerk character needs to have more to to them to justify an excuse to care about them. Movies like Klaus did this well because it foreshadowed a better side to the jerk characters. Red, on the other hand, shows no hint of redemption in his character arc, all the while remaining stuck up his own ass and treating Blue like shit throughout a large portion of the movie. I already don't buy that these two would be good friends, but that mainly comes to how much of a jerk Red is. Nothing he does in this movie is enough to make me see a better side to his character, and every time he tries to be funny, it only makes him even more unbearable to put up with. There's no point in the movie where he shows a soft side for Blue, and while you could argue that happens when he goes to the volcano, that is thrown out the window by that stupid cliffhanging scene. Even the scene before it has Red completely ditch Blue just to fuck around with some chicks, which only cements the friendship plotline's forced execution and Red's unpleasant attitude. And now that I think about it, a lot of the characters aren't that good either. Blue, for example, is definitely more sympathetic and kind-hearted than Red, but he also carries the cliche of the loser man who's scared of everything and eventually turns out to be a badass later on. And when it's not that, he can come off as a bit too whiny at points. The female characters pretty much add nothing to this movie, even if this is probably Pink's best role in the series since she never comes off as selfish or impatient like she is in most of the web series. The villain, while having a few funny lines every once in a while, still comes off as the generic bad guy who's out for blood. I think the only character I got the most enjoyment out of was Lord Tourette's, but even that feels weird because it feels like I'm laughing at a disabled person. I actually don't find Lord Tourette's running gag to be that funny. You either have to make him a jerk or make his angry side more natural for it to be funny, but the only laughs it gets is Ben Teller's performance and nothing more. Speaking of which, this movie is painfully unfunny. I think on my rewatch for it, I only laughed out loud once during the whole thing.
Holy crap! I almost died.
You're welcome, motherfucker.
That's not to say there weren't other funny bits in the movie, but not enough to say the humor as a whole was anything to write home about, especially since I watched this right after Shrek 2 and Sausage Party, which were both incredibly funny in their own rights. Most of the humor in this movie boils down to the interactions of the characters, but since they aren't very interesting or likable to begin with, that already doesn't sell it for me. Or jokes that are meant to be seen as awkward but either don't work because the joke drags on for too long, or crams in meme humor that makes it incredibly dated. Not to mention the common attempt of lowbrow jokes like farting or vomiting, because they were needed apparently. I also feel like Dick Figures the movie never truly feels as shocking or outlandish as it could have been. In my country, this movie is rated R18+, the Australian equivalent to NC-17, which is hysterical. I mean, Sausage Party is rated MA over here, and that movie had even worse explicitity, like tons more swears, some grotesque violence, racial stereotypes, and of course that activity towards the end. The fact this movie has an R18 rating when it only has a couple swears, less grotesque violence, and no sex scenes makes it feel incredibly tame compared to Sausage Party. Oh, and this movie's plot holes are really evident and do not work. I don't care if Dick Figures is meant to have random shit going on, even if I can buy a character dying and coming back to life, but how can the main villain and Ocho Muerte be in two different places during that flashback when it's revealed they're both the same person? At least with Sausage Party, the more outlandish moments feel better explained, like how the humans can now see the food talking because they're on drugs. Here it's just there, and the movie expects us to buy it because it's Dick Figures. Yeah, no thanks. So in conclusion, I really don't like Dick Figures the movie. It's not an awful movie by any means, but I can't overlook the flaws and just enjoy it as a mindless comedy. When the actual comedy fails so hard, it doesn't help that fact either. Topped off with a forced friendship plotline, bland unlikable characters, and really noticeable plot holes, and this movie is just a mess. Really, the only good things it has going for it is the animation, soundtrack, and a few of the voice actors. This movie just has not aged well at all, much like the show it's based on. It's still a far better watch than something like the original Styx movie, but this is not something I can recommend even to people who enjoy adult animated content. If you really want an explicit but funny adult animated film, just go watch the likes of the South Park movie or Sausage Party instead. I guarantee you won't regret it.